That can go off. I'm going to need them now. Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to this special stream with my very special guest. That happens to me every time I do this, but that's because I'm amateurish and a boomer, except I'm not a boomer, really. Welcome to this special stream with my very special guest, Apostolic Majesty. As always, to give people a bit of time to get into the chat, I'm going to start us off with a tune.
Темная ночь, только пули свистят по степи, только ветер гудит в проводах, тускло звезды мерцают. В темную ночь ты, любимая, знаю, не спишь, и у детской кроватки тайком ты слезу утираешь. Как я люблю глубину твоих ласковых глаз, как я хочу к ним прижаться теперь губами. Темная ночь разделяет, любимая, нас, и тревожная черная степь пролегла между нами. Верю в тебя, дорогую подругу мою, эта вера от пули меня темной ночью хранила. Радостно мне, я спокоен в смертельном бою, знаю, встретишь с любовью меня, чтоб со мной не случилось. Смерть не страшна, с ней встречались не раз мы в степи. Вот и теперь надо мною она кружится. Ты меня ждешь, и у детской кроватки не спишь, и поэтому знаю, со мной ничего не случится. И поэтому знаю, со мной ничего не случится.
And that was Dark is the Night, which is a pretty well-known Soviet World War II song about a soldier missing his wife, as far as I can work out. I would like to introduce my very special guest this evening, Apostolic Majesty. He doesn't really need much introduction. Absolutely one of the best history channels on YouTube. Certainly one of my favorite history channels on YouTube, and someone I wanted to have on stream for a very long time. Good day to you, Apostolic Majesty.
Hello, Duke. It's wonderful to be invited on to discuss this topic, and it's wonderful to finally make an appearance on your channel. I'm just sorry that this hasn't happened sooner.
Well, better late than never, as my father always said. So, this evening we're going to be talking about Anglo-Soviet relations in World War II, and it's it's kind of something that you're going to be doing a bit of a series on, isn't it, AM?
Yes, I do have to apologize to everyone who is trickling in from as part of my regular audience, because I had planned to do a lecture on the history of Anglo-Soviet relations, in particular the relationship between Churchill and Stalin prior to this stream, but unfortunately I have failed that test of endurance, and it's beyond me to prattle on for 2 hours straight. So hopefully next week I'll be able to fulfill the promise I made, in addition to having a roundtable discussion on the geopolitical landscape of the Soviet Union and Stalin's grand strategy. So hopefully people can tune into that as well.
Yes, I'm looking forward to both of those. I mean, the lecture method that you use, I mean, it's excellent, but yeah, it's very hard on the larynx and the voice and what have you. I'm also looking forward to the roundtable discussion that you've got lined up, because it's got an excellent military historian in the shape of Furious Pertinax, who is, in my opinion, a very good military historian.
He completely outclasses me on every level when it comes to the military history, I have to point out. Unfortunately, I'm not a good military historian. I'll put my hands up and say that. So from my point of view...
But it's complementary, isn't it? It's complementary, because you do the political and the diplomatic and that kind of stuff. And so if you've got a military historian on your show, then they can fill in those bits.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm very lucky to have him.
Yeah, I know he's really good. I wish he could do some more stuff on his own, actually. I was also going to say there is a link to Apostolic Majesty's channel in the description of this video. So if you don't already subscribe to him, which I'm sure the vast majority of people here do please go and subscribe to AM. You won't be disappointed if you love history. Also, if you want to send super chats, you can do so. You can do so via Entropy, and the link is pinned at the top of the chat. Okay, AM, because you're the expert in terms of the diplomacy and the politics of this stuff, would you like to kind of set the scene for the rest of our discussion this evening?
All right. Well, this isn't just a stream about a particular sort of series of countries aligning a particular point of time. You can say that this is the history of these nations finally recognizing each other, in addition to forming an alliance, because in the First World War, the Russian Empire had fought alongside Great Britain in fighting the Central Powers. But of course, during the course of that war, the Russian Empire had collapsed, and ultimately, through a civil war, made way for the creation of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic and ultimately the Soviet Union, which of course was a communist Bolshevik state, which was anti-clerical, anti-capitalist, and totalitarian, to put it, to understate it almost. And so in many ways, the Soviet Union represented not just an antithesis to Western civilization, but an antithesis to Britain in particular. Britain, which before World War I had no history of a large state, even military conscription, which was only introduced belatedly during the course of World War I. And in terms of bringing up Churchill in particular, when Germany was defeated, Churchill was actually the most vocal in opposing the consolidation of this new Bolshevik regime in Russia on principal grounds. The idea that Bolshevism represented an existential threat to the West and it had to be killed in the cradle. This was something that he would later reiterate as leader of the opposition in 1949. So the question I'm interested, therefore, is how you can take that position, which is antithetical to the notion that the Soviet Union can even exist as a nation or an empire or some form of sort of proto-embryonic sort of revolutionary state which will take over the rest of the world. It doesn't really matter. And go to the position where Churchill's legacy is effectively solidifying and enabling the Soviet Union to take over Eastern Europe, consolidate its position into the future for the next 40 years.
Extremely well put. I'm going to give a little plug for a stream I did about a week ago, a bit less than a week ago, with Rupert August, who's also a very good chap. on the Anglo-Japanese alliance between 1902 and 1922. And towards the end of that stream, we had a fair bit to say about British and Japanese involvement in the Russian Revolution and trying to fight on the side of the whites, the White Russians. So that might be worth looking at for some people if they're interested in a bit more history. But as you say, you can't argue that Churchill's position or the positions he talked about were not the positions his policies actually ended up making come to pass, shall we say. And it's not just true about the Soviet Union. I mean, it's also true about the British Empire. Churchill's policies had a directly bad effect on the British Empire.
By means of an introduction on Churchill, the narrative around Churchill is laudatory in the extreme in some cases, but I would say it's ultimately unsatisfactory from someone who is as inquisitive as I am. And this is because I like to judge historical figures by their own metric of failure, essentially. What do they want to achieve and were they successful in that end? And what I find fascinating about Churchill is that, especially on the domestic front, he had no agenda whatsoever. He would flip-flop continuously. I don't even see him as a conservative politician. He started off as a conservative, almost as an extension of his father's career, that, of course, being Randolph Churchill. But even Randolph Churchill was a bit of a maverick in the whole scheme of the Conservative Party. So Churchill inherits his position effectively in the Conservative Party, but only becomes a significant force in British politics when he crosses the floor and joins the Liberal Party, and is therefore part of the administration with Lloyd George, which brings about some of the most significant social reforms in British history. At the same time, when the Liberal Party collapses in the aftermath of the First World War, he crosses the floor again to join the Conservative Party under Stanley Baldwin, and leads a very undistinguished career as Chancellor of the Exchequer, only to be set adrift, cast out of 2 cabinets in the course of the 1930s, only to be reluctantly brought in at the beginning of the war in 1939. And then he effectively achieves power, not through his dominance of the Conservative Party, but by essentially sidelining figures like Halifax and Chamberlain, and making a pact with the Labour Party, which of course would be crucial in terms of smoothing relations with the Soviet Union. And of course, when we have Clement Attlee's tenure as Prime Minister, does Churchill do anything fundamentally to oppose the Attlee reforms when he becomes Prime Minister again between 1951 and 1955? No. Churchill very much inaugurates the post-war consensus by preserving many of Labour's reforms, which is still with us today. So on the domestic front, I see no clarity from Winston Churchill. And this unfortunately leads us to an exploration of his own stated milieu, which was the preservation of the British Empire and Britain's own position in the world. And in that scheme of things, he was an unequivocal failure. I would even say that, I mean, this isn't an original statement from mine. This is a consistent thread. I mean, one of the most recent sort of long expositions of this position was put forward by Pat Buchanan and The Unnecessary War. But the fact that Churchill's policies were fundamentally self-defeating from the point of view of the preservation of the empire, and resulted in the acceleration of the demise of the empire in both the First World War and the Second World War, just to sort of clarify my position on Churchill. But what I find fascinating about this is that when I brought up the case of Churchill intervening in the Russian Civil War for moral reasons, ostensibly, that of it being a principal crusade against Bolshevism, when it comes really to the First World War and indeed the Second World War, Churchill has no difficulty in aligning with what he himself referred to as the devil when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. So I look at a man who looks in a very sort of narrow strategic picture of the world, which is Russia representing some sort of countervailing force against the center, in this case Germany. And therefore, it doesn't really matter what government is currently at the head of a Russian state, whether it be Tsarist, whether it be some sort of a democratic government which would emerge in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, and of course the Soviet Union. So in terms of trying to pinpoint what Churchill's sort of sincere thoughts towards the Soviet Union, you can almost say it's Westphalian, that he is looking at the Soviet Union purely in terms of international power politics, divorced from any moral considerations. What complicates this view significantly when looking at Churchill is that the position against National Socialist Germany was a principled stand. So Churchill was simultaneously taking a principled stand against National Socialism while completely ignoring any such moral qualms when it came to the Soviet Union, which is why I find looking at this area of history so fascinating.
Yeah, I agree with 99.9% of what you just said there. I am. I've done a number of streams with a chap called Horace, who's very interested in World War I and World War II history, both on my channel and on his channel, talking about basically some of it was about Winston Churchill between 1914, well, actually 1904 and 1945. Some of it was more generally on British policy, etc. And our conclusions on that were exactly really what you've just been saying. Churchill was a total failure at keeping up the British Empire, which he always claimed was his number one object, but it seemed to be the main thing he worked against if you look at actually what he did. And I do not understand why he's still held in such high regard. I understand why our modern elites want him to be held in such high regard, but I don't understand why he's held in such high regard by the general public, except for the fact they're misinformed, basically.
Well, no, I don't think it's quite that simple. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to project a nuanced historical viewpoint onto a population at large. This is where one draws the distinction between popular memory and academic history. However, when it comes to Churchill was brilliant in many ways. He just wasn't brilliant on the strategic level.
Yes.
He had an uncanny ability to survive in British politics, given the fact that he was a prominent feature in British politics for 50 years. That shouldn't be understated. He was also a brilliant self-publicist. And what we have in terms of the legacy of Churchill is very much the invention of Churchill himself.
Yes,
But-
he was an excellent writer, I will say that for him.
And on top of that, I also believe that Churchill was a great historian in the literary sense, in the terms of him being able to formulate rhetorical devices and turns of phrase which would stick not only with the population at the time, but through the population throughout the ages. They're basically immortalized for the cases of posterity. And that does require a genuine gift. And in terms of his ability to speak, in terms of his ability to win over a crowd on an emotive level, that cannot be understated in terms of his own political capabilities within the British system. But unfortunately, that is completely divorced from any long-standing practical vision about how to achieve his aims, which were the preservation of the British Empire. They're two separate conversations.
Yes. I totally agree. Look, I said on the stream I did with Rick August a few days, well, probably about 5 or 6 days ago, on the Anglo-Japanese naval treaty, almost any Royal Naval disaster between 1914 and 1945, almost any of them, if you trace them to their root, you will find Winston Churchill.
Yes, and of course, in terms of his endurance, he is First Lord of the Admiralty at the beginning of the First World War, and indeed at the beginning of the Second World War. And he repeats many of the same mistakes regarding his overall sort of strategic position in the First World War and in the Second War. So in terms of just outlining the beginning of the Anglo-Soviet détente and later full-fledged alliance to defeat National Socialism, of course, this isn't something which originated with the British. This is something which Stalin is significant because Stalin went a long way to normalize relationships with the West. First of all, this involved various trading agreements, say, for example, with Iran, which is going to play an important part in this discussion, but also normalizing relations with Poland. In fact, there was a non-aggression pact with Poland, I believe, signed in 1932, because what the government, essentially the Soviet regime before Stalin, during the early years of the Russian Civil War, especially 1920 to 1922, or even 1919 represented, was essentially the vanguard of the international revolution, the proletarian revolution that was supposed to take Europe and by extension the rest of the world by force. When various sympathetic communist revolutions in Hungary and Germany failed, and the Russians were pushed back from Poland, this led to a lot of soul-searching, and in the argument, Trotsky, who was the more bellicose of the two compared to Stalin, lost, and Stalin argued for a process of internal consolidation. You can really say that Stalin is more responsible than any other figure for turning the Soviet Union from a revolutionary project into a nation state in the traditional sense of that word, albeit a nation state committed to the carpet bombing of what it originally meant to be Russian, and the subordination of all forces, agricultural, industrial, and political, cultural, to the state. My conception of Stalin very much is of that of a Red Tsar, but this goes a long way to explain how governments in the West, beginning with the rise of Hitler in 1933 to 1934, can treat essentially with the Soviet Union despite the intent of international Marxism, which is the world revolution. Of course, France at this time is responsible for beginning these overtures towards the Soviet Union. There is a mutual assistance treaty, which is signed in 1935. There is an alliance between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, which is also ratified on paper, albeit it ultimately amounts to nothing. So Stalin, from the beginning, is willing to hear out possibilities of a détente, rapprochement with the Western powers. And of course, Britain goes along with this. However, in the end, Stalin doesn't follow through on any of these treaties because the Western powers cannot give Stalin what he needs, which is the restitution of the old borders of the Russian Empire. Because in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War, the Soviet Union now lacked Finland, Bessarabia, the Baltic states, and indeed most of Poland, virtually all of which, with the exception of Prussia and Galicia-Lodomeria, had been part of the Russian Empire before the First World War. So Stalin was interested in pursuing an old Russian foreign policy. That was the restitution of a specific territory, as opposed to exporting the revolution everywhere all at once. And this is why the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 was infinitely more seductive to someone like Stalin, despite his revolutionary credentials, compared to any pact or alliance with Chamberlain and Daladier in the West, because Hitler promised Stalin exactly what he wanted, which is the restitution of these territories. So you can say that the first major attempts by the Allies to court Stalin ended in failure because Stalin was fundamentally interested in territorial revisionism as much as Hitler was. They had coinciding aims as opposed to incompatible aims. Moreover, Stalin was not interested in preserving the peace of Europe. Stalin was very much interested in seeing the capitalistic and fascistic powers declare war on each other, destroy each other, and then for the Soviet Union to come in, clear up the mess, and establish hegemony in Europe. So Stalin had fundamentally more devious strategic motives than the British and the French, who were desperately trying to hold on to an international order which had been in slow collapse since really about 1930.
Again, I totally agree with you. I would just point out in the early 1930s, Britain actually sold tanks to the Soviet Union, which interestingly were given the nickname in the USSR of British workmen, because of course the Soviet communists had deeply infiltrated the British Labour Party and the British Labour movement. Which had effects early in World War II, when the Stalin-Ribbentrop Pact was actually in effect.
The funny thing is, I just want to mention this beforehand.
Sure.
that really isn't actually going to be a significant part of this conversation, because Churchill, for all intents and purposes, almost didn't need the levels of infiltration. I mean, some of it is overblown. So, for example, in 1924, there is the Zinoviev letter, which helps push people towards voting for Labour and helping get the Conservatives back in power with a vast majority in 1924 throughout to 1929. Nevertheless, there are many Labour politicians who are sympathetic, and one figure that's going to appear early in the narrative is Stafford Cripps. Nevertheless, a figure like Cripps then becomes disillusioned with the Soviet Union more so than Stalin, that I find the more interesting. Indeed, if you look at Stalin's relationship with the Cambridge Five, for people who don't know, there were five prominent members of British society, three of which were civil servants. One, in fact, was in charge of the Queen's Royal Portrait Collection, who was Anthony Blunt, who were, throughout the 1930s and 40s, and really up until the early 1950s, responsible for passing a significant load of information, we're talking about thousands of documents, over to the NKVD and later the KGB. What is fascinating about Stalin is that Stalin ignored most of the information that was being given, believing this was all part of a deliberate ploy by the British to influence Soviet policy. So the level of infiltration might not seem as significant as it would be on the surface.
Yeah, I do agree with that again. However, a lot of union members, etc., in the early part of the war, there were significant problems with strikes and go-slows and stuff like this, which were partly a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and people in the British Labour movement not wanting to go against an ally of the Soviet Union, which is quite interesting, I find.
Well, it's a complicated picture, and maybe a help to understand the situation in global communism, not just the Soviet Union. Global communism was fractured as a result of the Stalin-Trotsky split. Trotsky tried to organize, say, for example, the Fourth International, in spite of the explicit policy of the Soviet Union. And so a lot of Soviet policy throughout the 1930s, Stalin's policy, is the elimination of anti-Stalin elements within various communist parties throughout the world. And this means, funny enough, a distinction between ideological communists, i.e. those who want to bring about the utopian socialist revolution with or without the Soviet Union, and those who are completely loyal to the Politburo of the Soviet Union, regardless of any hardline ideological considerations, like those, say, for example, who would follow the letter of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and essentially say that National Socialism is A-OK with us over capitalism.
Absolutely, yeah. There was also, I believe, early in the war, there was some discussion between Britain and France about even bombing places in the Soviet Union, particularly oil fields and so on.
This is a very significant point, because this also comes back to Churchill. Churchill is fascinating in that, okay, actually, no, I'll back this up a little bit and discuss the nature of the agreement made with Poland, which supposedly kicks off the war. As a result of you can say the failure of the Munich conference to prevent Germany from increasing its demands for territorial revisionism, and really the turning point supposedly is the occupation of Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939. Chamberlain makes a commitment to the Polish government, a guarantee, which is a guarantee to maintain Polish independence. Note that this doesn't mean Polish territorial integrity, albeit various parties can read whatever they want into what guaranteeing Polish independence would be. In terms of the logic of Chamberlain saying we don't want to guarantee Poland as is, Poland was, as you can say, interested in territorial revisionism as Germany was, because not only did Germany benefit from the dissolution of Czechoslovakia, but Poland and Hungary did. Hungary took South Slovakia, and Poland took Tetchin. And as a consequence of that, Chamberlain didn't want to reward revisionism by Poland at the expense of an ally which had been truncated, dismembered and discarded, like Czechoslovakia. Yet at the same time, a guarantee of Polish independence left enough ambiguity where the Germans could interpret it in a way that they could negotiate or threaten the Polish government over Danzig, and there was no actual hard commitment by the British government to come to aid on the part of Poland over Danzig in particular, and not over the issue of the guarantee of Polish independence. So you can say in many ways this lack of clarity actually helped make the war inevitable, because as you can say with Britain's stance in the lead up to World War I, Britain was not unequivocal in her position, not effectively ambiguous enough to create the conditions where there could be significant misunderstanding. And when we're talking about the beginning of the Second World War, I think avoiding misunderstanding is very important on a
100%.
diplomatic level.
Yes, yes.
But this has...
It had the wrong effect in Poland because it made the Poles absolutely weren't going to move because, we're guaranteed by Britain and France.
Yes, exactly. So we're talking about the possibility of the secession of Danzig and the Polish corridor, and effectively the beginning of World War II, which is why this is so significant. But this is also where the nefarious nature of Anglo-Soviet relations comes into play, because, of course, Germany invades Poland on the 1st of September. Britain interpreting this essentially as a German attempt to wipe Poland off the map, not guaranteeing Polish independence, declares war alongside France on the 3rd of September 1939. But of course, 2 weeks later, what happens? The Soviet Union, as per the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invades eastern Poland. So now the British government's in a bizarre position where they are, at the one hand, punishing Germany for having invaded Poland for territorial restitution, yet they are also turning a blind eye to the Soviet Union doing the same. It's quite funny actually looking at the legalistic explanations as to trying to get around this, which is, first of all, the Soviet Union had no intention of eliminating Polish independence. Well, if not, they definitely acquiesced to it, because as a result of the treaty, Poland was wiped off the face of the map. The second reading of this was that the Allies had agreed to guarantee Polish independence from European aggression. So by extension, Halifax tried to argue that the Soviet Union was not a European power, as utterly preposterous as that may sound.
Yes.
And of course, the underlying thing of all of this is that the ambiguity concerning a guarantee of Polish independence versus a guarantee of Polish territory as it existed before the German invasion on September the 1st, 1939. And the Germans, therefore, could be seen to attack Polish Poland, whereas the Soviet Union was simply reincorporating regions that weren't ethnically Polish, such as Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. But of course, in terms of, you can say, the spirit of the guarantee, this was in complete contravention of said spirit, and Britain and France were in the awkward position of appearing like hypocrites if their ultimate aim was the preservation of the status quo and fighting against aggressive nations, because the Soviet Union had just violated Polish territorial integrity, as had the Germans. So, and of course, it doesn't also help that Hitler, a couple of days afterwards, from the Polish parade, victory parade in Warsaw, offers peace feelers to the West, peace feelers which they also reject. So the Allies are now committed to the maintenance of this war against one of the aggressive parties and not the second aggressive party. Now, that's not to say that the British Foreign Office are happy about this. The main reason, sympathetic reason from the British point of view as to why this is happening, is they don't want to start a war with the two biggest continental powers that could oppose Britain and France, which is a valid strategic concern. However, Churchill does not take that position. Churchill, right from the outset, wants the Soviet Union to come to war against Germany. And therefore, he actually says this on popular radio. The expansion of the Soviet Union into Poland is actually advantageous for Britain, because it means that Hitler's expansion eastwards had effectively been blocked. So here is Churchill taking the extreme position that despite having guaranteed Polish independence, Britain having guaranteed Polish independence, it was actually a good thing for the Soviets to take over parts of Poland if it meant stopping Hitler.
Wasn't very good for a lot of Polish officers, has to be said. I'm referring, of course, to the famous Soviet massacre of Polish officers that they captured.
Well, I mean, this is the Katyn massacre, but I mean,
Yes.
but in terms of understanding the complications with this, I mean, the Polish government in exile was not united on this issue. In fact, I think they were overwhelmed, and thankfully for a contingent of the Polish army, they had the Romanian bridgehead strategy, which meant an aspect of the pre-war Polish army was able to escape to Britain, indeed the Air Force, and fight to live another day. But when you have characters like Sikorski, advocating that a Polish contingent ally with the Soviet Union and invade the rest of Poland, you can almost see that there is an acceptance that Eastern Poland has been lost forever, as per Stalin's territorial revisionism, and that so long as we can save the rest of Poland, then allying with the Soviet Union and Britain may be necessary. So it's not simply on Churchill, but nevertheless, Churchill represented, even before the fall of France, the most radical position of this. But to come to your point, which is the idea of bombing areas within the Soviet Union, really you can say that this represents a whole new strategic outlook for the Allies, which is almost completely overlooked. And this is brought on by the Soviet invasion of Finland, which wasn't in concert, of course, with the Germans. It wasn't in their shadow. This was a purely Soviet aggressive stance. And this was also before we have the invasion of Denmark, Norway, and of course, France and the Low Countries.
The Germans had agreed to Stalin taking over the Baltic republics again, I believe.
Yes,
but
that
not
wouldn't happen.
But not Finland. Yes.
That wouldn't happen until June of 1940. And again, there's a bit of ambiguity regarding the actual letter of the Nazi-Soviet pact. So, for example, in the original pact, Lithuania was going to be handed over to Germany, and Germany would have less of Poland proper, and now would be given over to the Soviet Union. So there were quite a few revisionisms and ambiguities here. But in principle, if Finland wasn't going to be directly annexed into the Soviet Union, as with the Baltic states and East Poland, then Finland was agreed to be as part of the Soviet sphere. And of course, Churchill also welcomed this because he believed more Soviet power in the Baltic meant more pressure on the German fleet in the Baltic Sea, and also pressure on Sweden, which was the main source of iron ore and I believe nickel and copper to Germany and Germany's war effort, which precipitates the Norwegian invasion. In fact, Churchill had proposed a preemptive attack on Norway even before the Germans carried out their attack. But of course, Hitler got there, and Hitler was actually successful in that endeavor, unlike the British. But what is
the Royal Navy were actually quite successful in the Norwegian campaign. The British Army was not.
I believe they sank quite a few German ships.
About a third of the German Navy got sunk, mostly by the Royal Navy, although the Norwegians also helped. But almost a third of the Third Reich's Navy was sunk during the Norwegian campaign. And in fact, if you look at that, that is what made Operation Sea Lion an absolute fantasy always. Because even if the German Navy had been at full strength, the Royal Navy was vastly superior. But after they lost a third of their ships in Norway, there was no chance that they could have supported an amphibious landing in Britain, even if they defeated the RAF, which would have been very difficult, because had the RAF really been losing in the Battle of Britain, they could merely have withdrawn a bit north and been out of German fire range.
I think this is interesting because it opens up a conversation as to what Germany wanted to do with Britain in the event of a negotiated settlement. And my view is that Germany, especially Hitler never understood the mentality of the British ruling class. He believed that Britain would be able to acquiesce to German control over the continent, and by extension be harmonized with National Socialism as per the the ethnic situation of Brits being English in particular, being fellow Germanics, and the idea that an old idea that Germany represented the land power and Britain represented the sea power, and that a powerful British Empire could effectively prevent American interest encroaching upon Europe as well, to prevent what happened in World War One. But regarding Britain's position to the Soviet Union, in particular Stalin's position, Churchill's position, Churchill viewed the expansion to Finland first as a good thing. Again, in terms of complete contravention to the French military, the British Foreign Office, and a large section of the British cabinet, because it followed this policy of strengthening Stalin's hand in the Baltic vis-a-vis the Germans. But of course, the public were horrified by the attack on Finland, and it severely complicated the whole nature, the casus belli, which France and Britain had against Germany, because the Soviet Union was seen as just as aggressive as Germany during this point. And when popular sympathy sort of weighed behind Finland, Churchill, again being the consummate politician, went along with said sympathy, but in reality it was despite his strategic considerations. And what's interesting here is that despite Churchill's, you can say, Russophilia in wanting to cozy up to the Soviet Union almost at any cost, if it meant defeating the Germans, Halifax and sections of the British cabinet, indeed the French military staff, looked at this as an opportunity to attack the Soviet Union, i.e., the Soviet Union and Germany were economically linked, intrinsically linked. In fact, the German war effort was contingent upon oil supplies coming from Baku. Moreover, both the Soviet Union and Germany represented aggressive powers which potentially threatened all of the little states in Europe, which again, the Allies were supposedly protecting. So in terms of actually following through and not being seen to be hypocrites, it made sense, both in terms of actually damaging the German war effort through attacking their logistical supply and through moral reasons, and indeed just pure considerations of having little countries like the Baltic states, like Sweden, like Romania on board. In fact, looking at this strategy of attacking the Soviet Union, say, for example, bombing Baku, which was intended through Syria, or supporting Ukrainian independence movements, the Ukrainian sort of independence movement became reminiscent of what's going on today as a result of as a result of the Holodomor and as a result of collectivization, which severely impacted Ukraine. The Ukrainians had a grudge against Stalin at this point, or indeed sending an expeditionary force of, say, 40,000 men to aid the Swedes in the aid the Finns in the Winter War. This had a lot of sort of strategic implications in terms of damaging and, you can say, getting rid of this strategic ambiguity regarding the nature of the German-Soviet alliance and actually attacking the Soviet Union as a means of attacking Germany. And also consider the whole Allied thinking was defensive. Gamelin, the chief of staff of the French army, did not believe the Allies could launch an offensive into Germany until 1942. So almost like the First World War, the strategic thinking before the fall of France is predicated on these, you can say, Balkan strategies, i.e., weakening Germany by attacking the various countries which are propping it up. And therefore,
well, it's the other way around, really. I mean, in the First World War, it was Germany that was supporting Austria-Hungary,
yes, I know.
Turkey,
that
Bulgaria.
That, if anything, though, solidifies my point, because there was more strategic impetus for attacking the Soviet Union than it would be, say, for example, for attacking the Ottoman Empire, which ends disastrously because the Ottoman Empire was not propping up Germany, it was the other way around. But of course, bombing Baku, supporting a Ukrainian independence movement, supporting the Finns, would take pressure off the political pressure of launching an offensive on the Western Front and keep the war distant from France. So, and in terms of also the implications of tying the Soviet Union and Germany together, Japan is not at war with Britain yet, nor is Italy at war with Britain yet. So associating Germany with communism, the idea would detach fascist Italy and Japan. Italy, by the way, had no real interest in the Soviet Union, even though Mussolini would send a doomed expedition there. In the same way, Japan had more than enough reason to attack the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Not only for resource reasons, but
Yes.
also ideological reasons. In Harbin, there was a large contingent, essentially the remnants of the Russian White movement. So the idea was attack the Soviet Union, and it would bring Italy and Japan, and even potentially America, onto the Allied side. But of course, Churchill was completely against this, and all strategic planning regarding this was undermined by two factors. One, Stalin realizing this could possibly happen, because this is not something simply to discount. Stalin was terrified of this. He was absolutely terrified that the Winter War would be used as a pretext to force Germany and the Soviet Union to fight side by side. So rather than pushing for total victory in Finland, Stalin makes peace with the Finns in March of 1940, and then, of course, the main sort of reason for abandoning all these goals was the fall of France in May and June of 1940, which completely changes the political situation in Europe and leaves the Soviet Union as the only power which can potentially defeat Germany in a land war.
Yeah, absolutely. To give a couple of military points to this, in 1938 and 1939, the British General Staff and the Admiralty were very clear to the British government that Britain didn't have the military forces to win a quick war and didn't have the financial resources to win a long war. This was explained to all the politicians by the military. And also the Royal Navy in particular, which was far and away Britain's most important armed force in World War II. People don't realize this today, but the Royal Navy was still slightly, even over the Americans, biggest navy in the world in 1939, but not by very much due to the Washington Naval Treaties. And I've done streams about that and why that happened and why, from Britain's point of view, it was an awful idea and how Winston Churchill totally supported it, particularly when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And the British Royal Navy was planning for a war that started in either late 1941 or early 1942, when it would have been infinitely stronger than it was in September 1939 when the war actually broke out. Yeah, you've got to look at this strategic situation. Britain was considerably weaker in 1939 than she had been in 1914, for example. The Royal Navy was vastly more powerful compared to the German Navy in 1939 than she had been in 1914, even though in 1914 the Royal Navy was still a lot more powerful than the German High Seas Fleet, which was a major mistake of the German Kaiser, because he had to actually, I think it was in 1911 or 1912, the Germans actually admitted that we can't outbuild Britain, it's just not possible, because Britain had such a large and efficient warship building industry. If only we did still. But anyway, so there was that. From the military point of view, the idea that Britain, an island nation, can fight huge continental land powers like Germany and Russia without a lot of allies is frankly ridiculous. And any British politician except Winston Churchill would have realized that.
And then just to clarify this, someone in the chat is mentioning the fact that a lot of Frenchmen were desperate not to die for liberal democracy and capitalism. Well, this is a fundamental point also to consider. It wasn't even the communists who were agitating for peace. Again, you can say in line with almost contravention of Soviet policy in some cases, but in some cases they were taking their orders directly from Moscow not to attack Germany. But there is another consideration here, which is the fact that there was significant opposition from the right against the Third Republic, opposition which would ultimately result in the dissolution of the Third Republic.
Yes.
Gamelin's appointment as chief of staff of the French army was predicated less on his ability and more on his allegiance to Daladier and later Paul Renault, and the continuation of the French political system. So the longer that this war dragged out the phony war, dragged out without any military successes for the Entente, let alone what would have happened as a result of military failure, would have meant potentially the collapse of the French government as well. So looking for these alternative strategies, such as the bombing of Baku, had a major political component as well, because they prevented the horrific meat grinder of the First World War and could be presented to the French as some form of a strategic victory. But of course, with France now wiped out and the Soviet-German alliance actually looking quite strong here, Britain has really no capability of fighting the war. Indeed, Britain hasn't really had to exert itself thus far due to the nature of the phony war, due to the fact that most of her army has been evacuated via Dunkirk, and that the war in France is over very quickly. So the reason I bring this up from Churchill's point of view and to illustrate his overall strategic incompetence, when the "we'll fight them on the beaches" speech is made, it ends with referring to this idea that the new world will come to the salvation of the old.
Indeed.
Churchill believes that the salvation for the British Empire will come from the Americans, even though that was a completely fallacious argument. Yes, the Americans would willingly come along and defeat Germany, but they would not willingly come along and prop up the British Empire.
They hated the British Empire. The leadership of America mostly hated the British Empire.
Well, Roosevelt hated the British Empire. Again, more left-wing figures like Morgenthau. I mean, also remember that Morgenthau, who was the Treasury Secretary, his chief advisor was also a Soviet spy at this point. So there were many ideological considerations, but also the fact that America, since its foundation, has always been against the British Empire. America was founded fighting a war against the British Empire.
100%.
American power in the Americas was predicated on limiting British influence in the Americas, and by
except it wasn't. One of the things one of the big illusions that Americans have is that the Monroe Doctrine was somehow enforced by America. In fact,
no, I agree with you. I agree with you. My point.
It was absolutely enforced by the Royal Navy.
My point is
enforced the Monroe Doctrine.
My point is that the Americans would rather they enforced it rather than the dissolution of the Spanish Empire supporting the British. If anything, the dissolution of the Spanish Empire and what the British were able to exploit out of that serves as a template for what the Americans wanted to do for the British Empire regarding their own efforts towards decolonization.
100.
And I mean the fear of Britain and the Japanese Navy was quite acute in terms of American policymakers. I mean, Robert House, Edward House, not Robert House, he's from a Fallout game. House was responsible for basically terrorizing Woodrow Wilson in the course of the First World War to supporting Britain for fear of an Anglo-Japanese invasion of America. The idea that America was susceptible to a significant Japanese Navy in the Pacific and British Royal Navy dominance in the Atlantic was seen as strategically unacceptable. So either cozy up to Britain to prevent that happening, or ultimately find a way of destroying British naval power, which ensues as a result of the war.
100%, yes. I've talked about this in relation to the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty and the Washington Naval Treaty. The reason the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty was abrogated in 1922 was at the behest of the Americans, because they did not want the Royal Navy to be able to cooperate with the Imperial Japanese Navy, which would have given them an absolutely decisive advantage over the American Navy.
Absolutely, and this is a catalogue and a series of disastrous decisions which result in the end of the British Empire. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that while Stalin has done well out of his policy towards Germany. He has gained territory. I mean, at the same time that Hitler is consolidating his control over France, Stalin sends ultimatums to the Baltic states, which see them reincorporated into Russia, but reincorporated into the Soviet Union. At the same time, a couple of months later, he will send an ultimatum to Romania, which will result in the loss of Bukovina and Bessarabia to the Soviet Union as well. Even though Bukovina had never been part of the Russian Empire, Bessarabia indeed had. And of course, this put significant pressure on the German oil refineries in Ploesti, which is just north of Bucharest. So Stalin had gained a significant amount of territory. And he'd also been given significant leverage over Germany in the situation, because the Soviet Union was poised to essentially cut off the German war effort at any point. And also the resources, in particular the Baku oil, was responsible for enabling the German war effort in many ways. Now, you can almost say at this point, if the idea from Churchill is to continue the war against Germany at all costs, that would give the Soviet Union potential reason, essentially, to declare war on Germany at some point, hypothetical point in the future. But what I find fascinating about this is that a continuation of the war, from Churchill's point of view, would only damage the British Empire. It would mean having to rely on the Soviet Union and having to rely ultimately on the Americans to win the war for Britain, and essentially asking Britain for nothing in the process, regardless of Britain's own expenditure of resources. Nevertheless, Churchill in July and August of 1940 decides on this course, which again is quite a controversial course, and it relies essentially on Churchill purging his cabinet and the Conservative Party of various pro-negotiated peace elements, such as Halifax in particular. And the Battle of Britain, I would almost say the Battle of Britain is less a strategic victory for Britain. It's more of a political victory for Churchill. It's something that Churchill can rally behind, and is something that can galvanize popular support for the continuation of the war, which at this point, without the Soviet Union and against America, seems against impossible odds.
I absolutely agree with you, I am. Look, first of all, let me make plain that neither myself, and I'm sure I am, would in any way denigrate the bravery of the young pilots of Fire Command. They were very, very brave young men. Some of them went up 3 and 4 times a day to fight far more German aircraft than they had. And they were relatively successful. But had the RAF been losing the Battle of Britain, which in fact they didn't, they could have just withdrawn north of the Thames, and they would have been beyond the range of German single-engine MA-109, Bf-109 fires. And had they done that, the German bombers would have been chopped down in droves, because they needed fire escorts. You know, bombers didn't always get through in World War II. That was one of the things that was found. That's why the RAF Bomber Command, for example, switched to night attacks, and even then lost 58,000 men. Largely from German night fires. But the whole Battle of Britain thing is a myth. And even if the RAF had withdrawn north of the Thames, which would have still allowed them to intercept German bomber formations coming across to bomb London, for example, the Royal Navy was so much bigger in England. The Royal Navy, in Britain, was so much bigger than the German Navy. The Germans didn't have a chance in hell of landing a force in Britain and then keeping it supplied.
Nor did Hitler even want to do that.
No,
which is all the more remarkable.
He really didn't. I think if it was not for the guarantee for Poland, I don't think Hitler would have attacked Britain or France, to be honest with you.
Well, this is the Hess plan is quite indicative of, you can say, of some aspect of German thinking, which is aligning Britain and France and even potentially the Low Countries if they would have their independence guaranteed. But of course, that is eroded throughout the course of the war quite horrifically in the case of the Netherlands. the idea of an anti-Bolshevik crusade. And this is why, again, I find such severe limitations in terms of Churchill's strategic thinking. And again, I'm basing this off Churchill's purported aim, which is the preservation of the British Empire. And this doesn't make any sense if you look at Churchill's Russophilia, even apologetics towards the Soviet Union, and Churchill's Germanophobia, regardless if it's the Kaiser or if it's Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
And the reason I say this, Germany, again, if you take out France switching sides, Germany ostensibly represented the greatest threat to Britain from the continent, whereas the Soviet Union, ignoring America, represented one of the greatest threats to the British Empire, in particular India. So the best possible, I know this sounds very Machiavellian, but the best possible outcome in both wars was a protracted land war between Russia and Germany that would have exhausted and depleted both powers, while Britain stood out and tentatively supported whichever side looked like they were gaining a decisive advantage.
100%. 100%. I always say that, like, my ideal ending of World War II, or like climax of World War II, would have been the last SS Panzer Grenadier killing the last communist KGB guy somewhere near the Urals, to be honest.
And but again, this is
I
fascinating.
mean, as a British nationalist, that would be my view.
But again, this is fascinating, isn't it? That we're actually framing the conversation in terms of Britain's national interest, as opposed to defeating Germany at all costs, which seemed to be, again, Churchill's policy. And again, because again, it wasn't his policy just in World War II; it was also his policy in World War One,
Yes.
which was not just the fact that, I mean, it's remarkable to consider how in the First World War there had been a situation contrived where Britain and France were not at war with Germany, and yet Germany was at war with Russia as of the 1st of August. And yet in the following 3 days, they were able to fuck that up. This idea of the two greatest threats to the British Empire fighting a war, and all we have to do is sit back and do nothing. Indeed, there had even been a memorandum by Grey to try and detach France from the Russian alliance at the same time. And indeed, British pressure could have been placed on France to prevent France going to war alongside Russia. Instead, they don't do that. They get involved in a conflict, escalating it, and as a result, beginning the long process of the damnation of the British Empire. And of course, Churchill is fundamental to the declaration of war. Indeed, he's
100%.
jubilant. He's jubilant when Belgium is invaded, because it gives us the reason to go to war with Germany. In the same way that Churchill was jubilant when Germany attacked Poland, for the same reason that it gives us a war to go off and fight Jerry. I find it remarkable how, first of all, how short-sighted Churchill's policy is in this regard, but also how he never learnt from his mistakes. Also, that in both situations, all this would do would accelerate the loss of the British Empire. So having basically set up Churchill's almost suicidal posture regarding the defeat of Germany and his overtures towards America, which aren't the topic of tonight's conversation, bringing this back on the Soviet Union. As a result of this, Stafford Cripps, a Labour MP, again, the coalition now being formed, the wartime coalition, with Labour supporting Churchill over rebellious elements in the Conservative Party. And this is going to be a constant feature, by the way, in Churchill's career, him actually not being very popular among the Conservative rank and file. That's a constant feature. I don't believe the Conservatives ever forgot the fact that Churchill betrayed them to the Liberal Party, but also the fact that...
forgive me for interrupting you, but I've done a whole stream a whole video with Horace on British Empire preference tariffs, which is the reason that Winston Churchill left the Conservatives and joined the Liberals. And that was probably the last opportunity for Britain to turn the old Commonwealth, the old white Commonwealth, which is to say Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and back then also South Africa, into something real.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And Churchill was totally against it.
But why was he against it? I think he was against it for political reasons again, which is it was unpopular. And so rather than enforcing this policy, which would essentially have led to a common market for the empire, I
Yes.
mean, even looking towards Stalin's own policy, Stalin believed that a country was nothing more than an economic market. So we're talking about the transition from the British Empire as a loose federation of provinces which are have their own sort of local degrees of autonomy, and turning it into an economic and by extension a political bloc.
Yeah,
And so
the idea, if it had worked, eventually you might have got an imperial parliament which dealt with matters of foreign policy and defense.
exactly, and of course, at the moment, the empire essentially had a series of parliaments, not just the Commonwealth parliaments, but also the administration in India, the administrations in Africa, Malaya, etc.
Yes.
They were all, in many ways, virtually autonomous, with only lip service to the colonial office and, by extension, the prime minister. So, in terms of understanding the British Empire, this emphasizes a point that both I and Duke and myself have been making, that Churchill had no grand vision for the maintenance of the British Empire at all. And this
Nothing.
is
Yes, nothing at all.
consistent. And of course, this is maintained. Of course, now coming back to the Soviet Union again, from the fall of France, Churchill begins his serious correspondence with Stalin, implying that it was against Stalin's interests to maintain German hegemonic power. And there was an element of truth in that, i.e., Stalin had wanted a long, protracted land war in Europe, which would have weakened Germany. Instead, contrary to Stalin's expectations, Germany had won a very quick and decisive war on the continent. And as a result of that, Germany hadn't had to expend itself in the way that Stalin had hoped. But nevertheless, even despite that, so long as Britain was at war with Germany, Germany needed to fight a war effort in some kind, a naval war effort in the Atlantic, and of course, preventing the Allies from launching bombing raids. And so, in order to ensure the continuation of this war, from Germany's point of view, it still was contingent on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And as a result of this, the actual economic relationship between the two empires deepened during this process. So Churchill then set about to try and detach this alliance. Stalin himself weakened the alliance considerably by annexing Bukovina and Bessarabia, because Hitler felt the pressure emanating from such strategic proximity to Ploesti. But then we come to the importance of Yugoslavia.
Yes.
Of course, Yugoslavia, unlike Hungary, unlike Romania, unlike Bulgaria, which had become Axis powers, indeed, Romania joined the Axis almost in retaliation for the loss of Bessarabia and Bukovina. Yugoslavia, under the regent Prince Paul for King Peter, prevaricated and only very reluctantly in spring of 1941 joined the Tripartite Pact. Oh, sorry, not the Tripartite Pact, the Anti-Comintern Pact.
Yes.
And why this is significant is that because of various pro-Allied elements within the Yugoslav armed forces, Yugoslavia essentially could potentially act as a catalyst for bringing the Soviet Union into the war. And the logic was, if Yugoslavia switches sides and becomes part of the anti-German faction, essentially, then Russia will offer support to Yugoslavia to prevent being completely cut out in Europe, and that would be seen as a pretext by Germany to invade the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union realized that Britain was using any potential opportunity to bring the Soviet Union into the war prematurely. And just again to emphasize Stalin's strategic planning, on the one hand, there is the Suvorov idea, which is that Stalin was absolutely planning for a preemptive strike on Germany imminently. And then there is the other extreme, which is the idea that Stalin had no malicious intent towards Hitler whatsoever, and there was no provocation, and that he was...
The truth is in the middle, as it almost always is.
And the truth is in the middle. Stalin was actively planning for military contingencies in a war against Germany, because of course he was, because he wasn't strategically inept. And he was trying to prevent any pretext being given to Germany to allow Germany to uproot the alliance, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, prematurely, which would have left Stalin in a strategically disadvantageous position. Because you really need to appreciate just the volume aircraft, tanks, and the deployment of troops. I mean, from 1939 to 1941, I believe the Soviet Union's army, the Red Army, increased by 2 million men. The Soviet Union had more tanks, significantly more planes. So the Soviet Union just sitting and watching Germany fight a protracted war in Africa and a protracted war against Great Britain only had essentially to gain from a protracted war, which didn't involve the Soviet Union. So Stalin understood what Yugoslavia represented. It was an attempt by the British to force the Soviet Union into the war prematurely. And so, ironically, America, which hasn't even entered the war at the moment, but is anything but neutral, is entirely pro-British for, again, the reasons of taking over the British Empire effectively, completely supports the Yugoslav coup, as do the British. Stalin only tentatively acknowledges the coup and basically gives the go-ahead to various members of the Communist Party, who are quite muted and insignificant before the rise of Tito. And as a result of this, all that happens is that Yugoslavia is destroyed, decimated, and indeed Churchill's sort of campaign to preserve the throne of Peter is completely futile in the end against Tito and his partisans.
It was a total British failure, like so much of the first part of World War II.
With one exception, which is something I think that is completely incidental, not planned, which is the idea that Germany had to maintain troops, maintaining order in the Balkans, which was incredibly fraught throughout the whole case of the war. But that isn't something they anticipated.
No.
That isn't something they anticipated in 1941. Like I said, I believe...
it's often said, that Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was delayed by Yugoslavia and then Greece. I don't actually think that's true. And if it was maybe like 2 weeks.
Or maybe just a month, even, from late May until late June.
It wasn't long because of you've got this Rasputinia, I think that's what you call it, when everything in Russia is like mud. So you can't do much in the early spring in Russia. So far as I can work out, the Yugoslav and then the Greek campaigns, which were total defeats for the British, by the way, were British and the old Commonwealth forces, because of course we sent Anzac troops to Greece. They maybe delayed Barbarossa by 2 weeks, or maybe, as AM says, a month at very most.
Could I just emphasize your point about Greece, actually? Because this, again, represents a cumulative failure for Churchill. Greece had been attacked by Italy in October of 1940, disastrously. The Greeks had launched a counteroffensive into Italian-occupied Albania. And the British, by this time, by March of 1941, had sent, as you said, a military detachment to Greece. And indeed, in terms of Hitler's attempts to woo Yugoslavia, Hitler believed that the Greek problem had to be dealt with. However, his policy was to go around Yugoslavia, to go around Hungary, through Romania, through Bulgaria, which is a very long-winded way of actually getting to Greece. And even so, the front would be significantly contracted as a result of that. All the switching of allegiances of Yugoslavia does is precipitate a swift and decisive intervention in Greece by Germany, which knocks out Greece. And, in Churchill's sort of own conception of the strategic situation in the Mediterranean, you have the Suez, you have Cyprus, you have Malta, you have Gibraltar, which are the great sort of rocks of British security within the Mediterranean Sea.
Plus Alexandria, which was also a big...
Yes, as an extension of Egypt. And look at this. What's in between Malta, Alexandria, Cyprus? Of course, it's Crete. Crete essentially is the gateway to the Aegean. And as a result of a German airborne operation, which Marcus knows a lot more about than I do, Crete is lost. The British intervention is a complete disaster.
A near-run thing in Crete, it has to be said. It was a very near-run thing. The German airborne were never used again as paratroops on a large scale because they lost so many men at Crete. So that was a near-run thing. But absolutely, in general terms, you're totally right. I mean, look, the British General Staff said to Winston Churchill before the Greek campaign, they said, look, and they actually overestimated the number of German divisions that could be sent to Greece. I think they said it would be something like 16 or 17 divisions, and in fact, the Germans used about 9. But how on earth do you think that one Australian, one New Zealand division, and a British armoured brigade are like 2.5 divisions? How are 2.5 divisions going to defeat 9? It's not going to happen. It's like nonsense. Doesn't matter how good the soldiers are. And anyone except Winston Churchill, maybe, for example, Stalin, would have said, yeah, that's not going to work, is it?
I mean, this underlines not only his tactical ineptitude, but also his strategic ineptitude, because all he's done is try and contrive a means of inviting the Soviet Union into the war prematurely. And again, we're looking at this strategically as well. If the Soviet Union only has to gain by delaying the conflict with Hitler, therefore inviting the Soviet Union into the Allied camp precipitously would ultimately be detrimental to the Allied position. So in this case, all that has been achieved is the weakening of the British Empire and the British situation in the Mediterranean as a result of a failed attempt to court Stalin into joining the coalition against Hitler. And indeed, in terms of trying to counter for this and provide some preparation for the Russian armies. Of course, the British intelligence service have, by this time, they've cracked Enigma, and they are aware that the Germans are going to attack the Soviet Union. Churchill, from April of 1941, begins feeding information to the Soviets. But of course, you can say, from Stalin's point of view, Stalin believes that Hitler attacking the Soviet Union now, given the intricate relationship, you can say the necessary relationship between the two powers at this time, would be disastrous for Germany. And so he looks at this, he looks at the history of World War One and believes this is simply another doomed British attempt to force the Soviet Union into the war before it is ready. So he discounts the British the British military intelligence, even though it turns out to be correct. So even though this on the surface would seem to be Stalin's paranoia getting in the way essentially of him actively preparing a defense against Germany, there is a strategic rationale here, which is his hyper suspicion of Britain trying to get the Soviet Union into the war and onto the Allied camp by any means. But of course, when this does happen, the British and the Soviet relationship is only solidified as a result of this. Churchill has finally achieved his goal, even if it meant essentially that the Soviet Union loses 5 million men in the first year of the war, and the Germans have reached Leningrad. They're at the outskirts of Moscow. They've taken over Ukraine, and in the course of 1941, 1942, they will take over the Crimea as well. Despite that disaster for the Soviet Union, which no doubt delayed the war by 1 or 2 years, Churchill has finally achieved his most consistent foreign policy objective, Anglo-Soviet relations, which is to get the Soviet Union into a total war against the German Empire. At the same time, July and August of 1941, we have the Atlantic Conference in Newfoundland. And this is, yes, and even before, just emphasize, August of 1941, America does not enter the war until December of 1941, and yet Roosevelt and Churchill are already deciding the nature of the United Nations and American participation in the war.
Could I slightly say Roosevelt is deciding and Churchill's going along with?
Oh yes, I mean Roosevelt is incredible in the sense that Congress did not want war. The American population did not want war. Roosevelt needed a pretext to get to war, and of course he didn't have one as of August of 1941, especially not against Germany. The Germans were horrified by American neutrality essentially being a nuisance, a nothing. America was fully behind Britain. America had already signed the Destroyers for Bases agreement.
Which was terrible for Britain, by the way.
Yes,
But
exactly.
yes.
And great for America because it sets up the American empire afterwards. But Lend-Lease, of course, is keeping the British war effort going. As you mentioned.
Hang on, Ian. That's not true. Lend-Lease never really kicked in for Britain until about early to mid 1942.
Okay, that's fair enough. Again, when it comes to
it was signed in Congress much earlier, but obviously before any results came from it, it was a fair bit later. So it was mid to late 1942 before Britain was getting any Lend-Lease, and of course Lend-Lease was nothing like what Churchill described it. Britain in the Napoleonic Wars, for example, and also in World War One, had simply given aid to poorer allies. The Americans didn't do that at all. That was not what Lend-Lease was.
No, and I agree with you. Lend-Lease was essentially the basis for the restructuring of Europe after the war. And of course, when we have the Napoleonic Wars, I mean, the British seldom are able to create ideological conditions which can orient European powers, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, towards acceptance of the British Constitution. And even though there are some token amendments to a situation in Poland, there are token amendments towards a commitment to the abandonment of the slave trade, nothing that the British can actually action to impose on their allies who they've been financing over the course of 20 years, which of course are the Americans.
And they simply gave them thousands of muskets and swords and cannon and British currency. That's what they just gave it to them. And it wasn't Lend-Lease. It was your allies. There you go, Austria. There you go, Russia. There you go, Prussia, etc. And which suited British interests. Absolutely, it did. But there was no idea that this was some kind of huge debt you'd have to pay back after the war.
In terms of understanding this, because I'm already sort of emphasizing that Roosevelt had already decided to go to war against Germany.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The American neutrality patrols, as they were called, which were anti-German U-boat patrols, they weren't very effective, but they'd been going on for years before America went into the war.
Well, but again, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that Roosevelt completely circumvented Congress. And Lend-Lease is a perfect example of this. Lend-Lease was originally voted through as this idea essentially of fighting totalitarianism, fighting oppressive nations against smaller nations. But Roosevelt was given enough discretion to decide which powers were victims of oppression. And during the Yugoslav war, that logic was applied to the Soviet Union. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that Roosevelt, by early of 1941, was committed to bringing the Soviet Union into the war against Germany before even America was at war with Germany and Japan. And when we see the Atlantic Conference...
He absolutely was, yes.
And when we see the Atlantic Conference is the culmination, essentially, of the idea of Soviet, because this is after the Soviet Union has been attacked. This is the basis from which the Soviet Union will be ingratiated into the international system, and it is the basis of the later this week confirmed in January of 1942, which is essentially the Security Council, which then consisted of China and the three powers, the Soviet Union, Britain, and America, and would later come begrudgingly also to include France, which was after 1944, post hoc included as one of the victorious nations. So already...
How was France included as a victorious nation? I'm not quite sure, but yeah.
So already, before America has entered into the war, Anglo-American policy is to essentially establish the Soviet Union as a fundamental part of the post-war international structure in terms of completely reconciling what had been a completely reprehensible government, and talking about how reprehensible the Soviet Union was. Even before the Soviet Union began annexing territory at the expense of, again, the same country which had been offered a guarantee, namely Poland, the Soviet Union had just conducted a series of purges, which had resulted not only in cutting the head of the Red Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the elimination of about 1 million Communist Party officials, collectivization, mass famines. In every possible sense, the Soviet Union domestically represented a monstrous government, which was the antithesis of everything the Allies supposedly said they were fighting for. Yet at the same time, in terms of foreign policy, they were actively expansionist. And when we're looking at someone like Churchill, Churchill looks at this as a positive, not a negative, because the Soviet Union is following in the policies of the old Russian Empire. It is an imperial power, and we can do business with an imperial power. We can't do business with a nation which is wanting to completely unravel the international order, which, say, for example, a more militant socialist like a Trotskyite would want to achieve. And Stalin goes along with this, again, in terms of actually Stalin being actually consistent to his agreements internationally, and Stalin actually representing genuinely this idea of a Red Tsar. Stalin abandons the Comintern. He even changes the national anthem of the Soviet Union from the Internationale into the famous anthem of the Soviet Union. So Stalin makes many cosmetic attempts to facilitate this rapprochement between West and East, but also British-Soviet relations is really responsible for keeping the Soviet Union going, not just in terms of the supplies which have been given to the Soviet Union, but something I brought up recently on a stream, which was actually going through alternative history scenarios for how the Germans could have potentially won, or the Axis powers.
I watched those streams, AM. They're well worth watching, by the way.
Was the issue around Iran. Iran, of course, was in many ways the gateway for aid into the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union's situation in the Baltic, the situation in the Arctic, the situation in the Pacific was threatened by Germany and Japan. And so Iran essentially represented the best way of getting a vast amount of resources into the Soviet Union, but also, from the British point of view, securing oil for the Allied war effort. However, the regime of Reza Shah in Iran was ambivalent towards both the communists, the British, and the Germans, and the presence of German nationals in Iran was seen as a pretext to invade Iran in August of 1941.
By the British and the Soviets.
By the British and the Soviets. But again, this demonstrates the closeness of the cooperation, and you can say the desperation of the British to maintain the existence of the Soviet Union, again, at all costs, even invading a sovereign power, which again was apparently everything they were fighting against. And at the same, before, when you can say Finland, you can say that this was just a Soviet operation. But Iran shows that Britain was now aiding and abetting Soviet aggression against, and indeed actively joining it, Soviet aggression against an independent power, in terms of, you can say, the fatalistic logic of this agreement, this alliance with the Soviet Union, which I find so remarkable. And the way they got around that was by essentially removing Reza Shah, installing his son, Mohammad Reza, as a puppet, and then declaring Iran had willingly joined the Allies.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Look, I do not understand two things. I don't understand how Winston Churchill could go across and do that Atlantic Charter, which was basically anti-British Empire, in its most important respects, and then support the Soviet Union, which was absolutely anti-British Empire, absolutely anything to do with the old British Commonwealth. But yeah, okay, we'll support you just because you're fighting Hitler. I mean, to me, none of those things are consistent.
I would say Iran, despite the fact it represents the antithesis of everything the Allies were supposedly fighting for, I would actually say Iran is one of the rare instances of Churchill actually pursuing a pro-empire policy, because Iran, in many ways, is almost like the reinstatement of the 1907 Anglo-Russo, Anglo-Russian agreement over Persia, essentially, which is divvying up Iran into spheres of influence. So in many ways, in terms of almost the repetition of World War One and the repetition of Britain's imperial policy, you can say again, it is very much deja vu. The Soviet, Anglo-Soviet invasion or Operation Countenance. And indeed, so much of Churchill's thinking is now revolving around, say, for example, the African War and maintaining British control over Egypt. But of course, the logic following from this is that Egypt has only been imperiled because Winston Churchill prolonged the war, which necessitated Italy joining the war alongside Germany.
I was just going to say, like, Britain's animus with Italy, I would say, mainly goes back to Anthony Eden when he was Foreign Secretary, and Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. And historically, Britain was not against Italy running Ethiopia, because there were British colonists in northern Kenya who got on exceedingly well with Italian colonists.
Do you want me to even buttress that point even further?
Go.
I think it was in 1924 when Labour were briefly in power. But the relationship between Italian colonialism and British colonialism was such that elements of what essentially was British East Africa, but is now part of Somalia, were actually ceded to Italy during this point.
Yeah, there was a British Somalia, which actually was one of the few Italian wins in World War II. They made Britain leave it, but it didn't last for very long, of course. But Britain absolutely willfully made Mussolini and the Italians enemies, starting in about 1937. And they didn't need to do so because Italy was not originally an enemy of the British Empire.
It wasn't. I mean, it was more hostile to Germany than it was to
Yes,
Britain.
Absolutely it was. During the first time when Germans might have invaded Austria, Mussolini moved, 4 or 8 divisions to the Brenner Pass against the Germans.
And in terms of trying to explain this, Mussolini had a very good relationship with Hungary, and Mussolini also essentially wanted to carve out an Italian sphere of influence in the Balkans. So ensuring an independent Austria would prevent Germany from essentially gaining a foothold which could counter Italian influence in the Balkans. But of course, as a result of the British response to the Abyssinian War, Italy is pushed further into the German camp, and indeed a potential Italian offer of mediation in 1940 is rejected, and as a consequence, Italy joins the war as well. So, and even just mentioning the actual plausible theory from about December until March of 1940, which is that of a anti-Soviet German coalition, Italy would be essential in such plans in terms of wooing the Italians over. And indeed, even in my alternative history stream, I emphasize the fact that Italy was served best by remaining neutral and not joining with joining the Germans. So it is remarkable to think that Italy had more than enough reasons for not siding with Germany in the war. And yet, as a result of the continuation of the war, the British colonies in Africa, which were essential to maintaining the link with India and by extension the Far East, Malaya, etc., were deliberately imperiled in a way that they hadn't been, before June of 1940s. So
I think it's like Britain deliberately made Italy an enemy in World War II, in my opinion. We didn't have to do it. but we deliberately did, and foolishly, because as I said earlier, Italian colonists in East Africa and British colonists in East Africa got on famously. There was no problem with them. And I'm pretty sure an Italian-run Ethiopia in 1938 would have been a better run Ethiopia than the one that was run by Haile Selassie. But, that's just me. And I would equally say the same kind of thing can apply to Britain and Japan, particularly after the Anglo-Japanese naval alliance between 1902 and 1920. There was no reason for Britain to make enemies of Japan, except America, of course.
And of course, just to underline this point, because this is happening contingently with the Atlantic Conference and the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Britain and Japan allying was, you can say, a brilliant strategic maneuver in 1902, because it took significant pressure off the international settlements, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the rest of Malaya, which of course included northern Borneo. And by extension, it also ensured the independence of the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch essentially being very much aligned with Britain at this point.
And took enormous pressure off Australia and New Zealand as well.
So from Britain's point of view, a friendly Japan was essential. But of course, as a result of American policy, especially after the Japanese occupy French Indochina in 1940, the Americans adopt a deliberately bellicose posture towards Japan, including a embargo, which basically threatens to unravel the ongoing Japanese war in China.
Yeah, it gives Japan a very limited period when they can either go to war or they'll have to surrender.
And so the Americans have contrived a situation, essentially, where the British Empire in the East, which is underdefended as a result of the war in the West, is nothing more than collateral damage, a sitting duck, to allow the Americans to enter the war in the Pacific, which is remarkable. I mean, Churchill himself mentioned that the fall of Singapore was the worst defeat in British imperial history.
Which it was.
And all of this could have been avoidable if Britain had again stayed clear of the Americans, but of course they didn't.
Yeah, I mean, all right, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, AM, but the amount of military equipment, including modern fighters and modern tanks, etc., that Britain sent to Russia in 1941, that did not go to the British Far East garrisons in places like Hong Kong and Singapore and Malaya, had an enormous effect on the war.
That's actually fascinating. It's not a point I actually haven't considered.
I didn't think you would, because it's not you're not into military stuff. But I'd like to bring that up at some point. But I think we're getting a little. I'm getting a little ahead of where we are.
I think it's significant, because I felt that going on the British posture in the Far East was a bit of a tangent, because it didn't directly relate to Anglo-Soviet relations, but as you've demonstrated here, it does in a significant way.
It actually does, yes.
That the Anglo-Soviet alliance effectively jeopardized the British Empire in the East. So again, this is Churchill pursuing a policy which favored the empires that would eclipse and erase the British Empire.
Well, I mean, Churchill was constantly in World War II, even reading his own stuff. He was fairly convinced that the Japanese wouldn't attack, or so he claimed in public, at least.
But again, I think
as you know, AM, Britain had broken the German codes. We had broken some of the Japanese codes, and the Americans had broken many more of the Japanese codes. And I am fairly sure that a lot of that information was going into both British and American channels, if that makes any sense.
Well, my theory is, as you mentioned there, that the Americans were more advanced in this than the British were. Indeed, for the Americans, it represented perhaps a higher priority, even though Britain stood to lose significantly more than the Americans stood to gain, in the same way that Pearl Harbor happened at just the perfect time to bring.
With no American aircraft carriers in the harbor.
Yes, exactly. And of course, air power would be essential to the war in the Pacific and indeed in naval combat in general. But of course, when we're talking about the Atlantic Conference in August of 1941, this was already conceived. And of course, from Stalin's point of view, and again, another aspect of Stalin's strategic genius, but again, it also bears questions on Soviet military preparedness for a conflict with Germany in 1941, was the Soviet-Japanese Pact of Neutrality. Essentially, what the Japanese were doing was inviting themselves to become part of the broader war with Germany and Italy, whilst at the same time securing the territory of the Soviet Union, which could then continue that fight against Germany. So it is sort of remarkable here that Japan is almost following in the preferred direction of American policymakers, which is...
Well, the Japanese army was. The Japanese army, after the battles in 1938 against the Soviets, where they lost because Japanese tanks were crap, and Japanese tanks were crap all the way through the war. But the 1938 battles they fought in Manchuria against the Soviets pretty much convinced the Japanese army that, hang on, this is going to be a hard war. And the Japanese army were much more right-wing than most of the Japanese navy. You would, if you're interested in this, guys who are listening to this, go and watch the stream I did with the chap last week on the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance. The Japanese Navy were less right-wing extremists than the Japanese
Well, in terms
army.
of explaining what right-wing here means, you mean right-wing in the sense that they were anti-Bolshevik explicitly?
Yes.
And of course, the most right-wing faction of the Japanese army had actually been purged earlier in 1936, which favored an attack against the Soviet Union before an attack against China. And you can say by extension, I would actually look at the sort of battles of Kharkin Gol against Zhukov, which had again surprised the Japanese army. And I would actually say it was more interesting in terms of, because we're not talking about a united front in Japan. Japan was a series of factions which were at war with themselves as much as the rest of the world.
100%.
And what Kharkin Gol proved essentially to the Navy, which as a result entered into the ascendancy, was that given the army was already committed to fighting a land war in China, that inviting a land war against the Soviet Union as well would be disastrous. And by extension, the naval strategy or the southern resource strategy seemed to offer Japan a way of acquiring resources without seriously compromising the war in China and at effectively low cost, because the Japanese knew by early 1942, late 1941, that the British and the Dutch colonies were very, very lightly defended, which of course was proven by the very swift string of Japanese victories in the first half of 1942.
Yes. Also in the Philippines, by the way, the Japanese conquered the Americans in the Philippines pretty quickly.
Absolutely, yeah.
Rupert August, by the way, is the chap I did the stream with on the Anglo-Japanese Alliance. Very good chap. I hope Rupert will. I hope AM will do a stream with at some point. He's a very good, well-read chap in history. But yeah, look, and Churchill made this worse. Again, I'm conscious that I'm probably pulling us forward a bit here, AM, but Churchill made this much worse than it need to have been, because Britain was sending most of its modern tanks and most of its modern fighter aircraft to Russia in 1941 and not to the British Far East garrisons.
There's
Which,
another sorry, there's
if you were a British patriot prime minister, as Churchill is so often portrayed, like I said, I would have happily seen the last communist NKVD guy kill the last German SS Panzer Grenadier somewhere, near the Urals. And all of my stuff would have gone to the British Far East garrisons that I had spare. Churchill didn't do that. He sent it all to Russia.
There's another consideration which is beyond that of the Far Eastern debacle, which is also the fact that sending vast amounts of material to the Soviet Union would inevitably delay a second front opening up on the West and enabling essentially the Soviet Union to get a head start, which they do. And when Churchill does suggest various strategies, such as the attack on Italy, even an aborted attack on Croatia, they do not prove to be the soft underbelly of National Socialism. And essentially, the Croatian campaign never happens, but the Italian campaign gets bogged down. And of course, towards the end of the war in 1945, the Cello Republic still controls most of northern Italy at the time where the Soviets are encircling Berlin. So
that's Mussolini's titular republic, which is basically controlled by the Germans, yes?
The Italian Social Republic,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
So it seems that in every way, Churchill, either intentionally or by pure folly, is delaying again the Western advance and accelerating the Soviet advance. And just to prove that even more decisively, even though I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, what is the major operation being taken by the German army, the Wehrmacht, against the Soviet Union in the middle of 1943? Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk.
Yes.
Not only are the British funneling the Soviets with all the information they need to launch the counteroffensive, which essentially end all German offensives on the Eastern Front, but the Allied invasion of Sicily, and then by extension the switching of sides of the Italian government to be pro-Allied under the king, means that Hitler has to withdraw a large segment of the German forces in the east to occupy Italy and maintain a puppet government under Mussolini. So by doing so again, Churchill was directly aiding the Soviet Union in their war effort whilst establishing a front which went nowhere for the Allies throughout 1943 and 1945. But just
the ending song for this stream is going to be D-Day Dodgers, which you'll probably know I suspect, which was Lady Astor, who was a very rich, I think partly American woman MP in 1944, who claimed that all the British soldiers fighting in Italy were D-Day Dodgers, when everyone with a tiny sort of working brain works out that no soldier decides where he's going to serve. They're sent there.
Before sort of getting into the end, of course, there are several crucial things happening on the diplomatic level. So I've already mentioned the fact that we have the Atlantic Conference, and then that is followed up by essentially the creation of the alliance, the Grand Alliance, which is essentially the bedrock for the United Nations, which again, it's not just what I find so remarkable about this is that the Declaration of the United Nations, it presupposes a world system which will ultimately lead to demilitarization. It presupposes a world system in which there is national self-determination. And it also presupposes that there will be repercussions for aggressive parties. Now, what is remarkable about this is the total hypocrisy of such a statement re the Soviet Union, but also how the demand for self-determination is actively hostile to the British Empire, and that Churchill again went along with this. Because if one takes a very limited view of the United Nations Declaration of Self-Determination, then one can see this as the restoration of small nations in in Europe, and by extension, them not falling into the hands of the Soviet Union after the war. However, if one interprets that broadly, which many elements of the Roosevelt administration wanted, this means the self-determination of subject peoples within the British Empire as well. And of course, that is ultimately what ends up happening and what ends up being effectively if not explicit American policy throughout the 1950s. So again, I find it utterly remarkable the hypocrisy on the one hand shown to the Soviet Union and the active hostility of the Americans towards the British, again, all being aided and abetted by Winston Churchill. But again, the provision of the consideration that internal politics is going to affect foreign policy, the idea that there is a United Nations Charter against a war against want, effectively, and the fact that Churchill is so adamant that Russia should be treated as if the internal political situation should not matter. So again, this is rules for thee, but not rules for me, and it just sort of boggles my mind at the level of which Winston Churchill and Roosevelt were bending over to appeal to the Soviets to the point of complete hypocrisy. Even the idea that there was going to be a demilitarization of aggressive powers, whilst the Soviet Union was making the most formidable and armed war machine in all of history.
I can't argue with that at all, to be honest with you. I think it's totally true.
And this is just substantiated by further conferences. So the first major conference in terms of the post-war settlement, of course, takes place in Tehran, Eureka, which is rather appropriate considering the Anglo-Soviet invasion 2 years prior.
And it's the only one where the British managed to arrive better prepared than the Americans.
But in 1943, what is remarkable is that the provision is effectively made for unconditional surrender of the Germans, which ends any attempt at a negotiated settlement. Now, again, this solidifies what we've been talking about earlier, which was the British commitment to defeat Germany at all costs. Because as Iron Duke and I have postulated at the beginning of the stream, as is the case in both World War I and World War II, a prolonged campaign between the Soviet Union and Germany would have only benefited Britain in the long term.
100%.
And what the British are doing here is completely abandoning that position in terms of supporting the Soviet Union virtually unconditionally for the sake of defeating Germany. And I have to consider defeating Germany at what cost, because this even came at the idea of rebuking intelligence which has been fed through the Vatican, fed through Sweden, about a possible anti-German coup. And of course, a declaration of unconditional surrender for the Germans basically tied the hands of the German resistance, and they were predicating a anti-Hitlerian coup based entirely on good faith, when in reality the Allies had already committed themselves to complete victory. So
killing Hitler won't do you any good.
But not just that. But the point I'm making is that there is a war which is going to fight to the finish. Even if you were to have a coup, we would still end up losing the war. So why not fight?
That's what I'm trying to say. Is even if the anti-Hitler people, who were mostly monarchists and like guys who would have been pro-Kaiser and traditional German military leaders, shall we say, I think that's reasonable. Even if those guys had succeeded in killing Hitler and removing the Nazi leadership, they were going to get nothing from the West.
And the irony is that many of the more reactionary German officials understood this and believed that a negotiated settlement with the Soviet Union would be preferable to a negotiated settlement
might have
with the
even
West.
happened in 1943 from some things I've read.
Well, there was the Tresco plan. I mean, there was the Tresco plan, of course, and had Hitler been assassinated in 1943, which was possible, and had, say, for example, Himmler or the SS or some other member of the Nazi Party been able to hold on to power, and say the army had been able to take over, I do believe the best route for the Germans would have been a negotiated settlement with Stalin. And of course, in terms of benefiting Stalin, a aligned Germany could effectively have forestalled any advance in the West. So
Oh,
there is
absolutely, yeah. It had Germany and the USSR made peace in 1943. There was no way in 1943 or even 1944 that the Anglo-Americans could have invaded Europe. Not a chance.
So the implications of unconditional surrender effectively mean that at the cost of defeating Germany, Eastern Europe would essentially be handed over to Stalin. And indeed, the only real break on this policy is the percentages agreement between Stalin and Churchill. The idea that the Balkans,
this is Greece and this kind of stuff, yeah.
the idea that the Balkans would be divvied up into Soviet imperial and British imperial influence. And again, to give Churchill some credit, I do believe Churchill, despite his complete strategic ineptitude, understood Stalin better than the Americans, and indeed better than many members of the communist sort of international throughout the world.
I think Churchill came to the realization of what Stalin was about quicker than Roosevelt or his successor did, for sure.
But even in terms of either a utopian socialist or a vehement anti-communist, I think Churchill understood that Stalin represented he didn't represent really a threat to either. He wasn't a communist idealist, and at the same time, so he did represent this mold, this traditional mold of essentially wanting Russian expansion, and inevitably, as proven, Russian buffer states to prevent a repeat of the German invasion. And so, ironically, Stalin was a man that you could do business with, whereas the Americans would not accept anything other than total submission, total unconditional loss of the British Empire, which is all the more remarkable when considering, which is why the percentage agreement really emphasizes that, because the percentages agreement was a understanding between Churchill and Stalin that Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria would essentially be in a post-war Soviet sphere, while Greece would be in a pro-British sphere, not pro-Allied sphere, pro-British sphere, essentially trying to rescue the situation which Churchill himself had created in 1941.
100%. But it is what actually resulted. I mean, like
with one exception, which is Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was agreed to be half and half. There would be a Soviet-British presence essentially in Yugoslavia to avoid it effectively switching one way or the other.
It kind of like worked
ultimately in
the middle.
1948, but not as a result of the British, as a result of Tito.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I agree totally. But basically, Churchill was saying, all right, the 20% is Greece and Britain will keep that. And we did, but only after fighting a lot of battles in Greece in 1945 against Greek communists. That, like, a lot of British soldiers got killed fighting Greek communists in 1945.
Where do the Americans come into this also? What is remarkable is that the Americans, who are consistent anti-imperialists, I believe anti-imperialists before anti-communists, view this percentages agreement as a fundamental rebuke of the United Nations Declaration, which of course is essentially nothing more than a fig leaf. It's nothing more than a shibboleth, rather, because in reality, the Americans are acquiescing to Soviet control over Eastern Europe, and in reality, they're dressing down Churchill and saying that Britain can no longer afford an independent imperial policy, which was proven even more decisively in Suez in 1956.
Yep, absolutely. By incidentally, Anthony Eden, who was the original guy who made Italy enemies of Britain, which they had never been before.
In terms of trying to find a poetic way of explaining this, you can almost say that the percentages agreement represents the rising star of the empire of Stalin and the setting sun of the British Empire.
Yes.
Both are attempting to effect an imperial policy. The Soviet Union succeeds with American acquiescence, and the British fail due to American condemnation.
Yeah, pretty much. pretty much. I mean, I'd like to talk a little bit about British aid to Russia during World War II,
Sure.
if you would be interested in that.
No,
Ian.
I'm very interested in that because I, of course, only really talked about the strategic and diplomatic implications.
I don't disagree with you at all in terms of the diplomatic and political aspects. I think you're entirely correct. But let us have a little look at British aid to Russia in World War II. Now, the first one I'm going to bring up, if I can find it, is something from Hansard, and it's Russia, British Empire War Assistance, and it was from the 16th of April, 1946. And Colonel Crossway Eyre asked the Prime Minister if he will publish, and of course this Prime Minister was Attlee, the socialist dude, if he will publish a comprehensive statement giving a list of weapons and materials together with their costs that were supplied in aid to the USSR by the British Empire between the 1st of October 1941 and the termination of hostilities in Europe. The Prime Minister, Mr. Attlee, the socialist dude, replied, "Yes, sir, I am circulating a full statement in the official report. The House may like to have the following summary of this. In the period from the 1st of October 1941 to 31st of March 1946, we, i.e. the British, supplied the Soviet Union 5,218 tanks, of which 1,388 were from Canada, and we supplied the Soviet Union with 7,411 aircraft." That's a lot, all right? That's a lot.
I think just if I remember correctly, in terms of like comparing this with Soviet equipment, the Soviets have produced about 20,000. I mean, just T-34 tanks, I believe, not including other tanks. So we're talking about, including other tanks, we're probably talking about as many as a fifth of the entire sort of armored stock of the Soviet Union.
Approaching 20% of their tanks, yes.
That really is quite incredible. But again, these are also supplies which are going towards the establishment of an empire for Stalin and not going towards the Western war effort.
Attlee carries on. The total value of military supplies dispatched amounts to approximately £308 million. Now, of course, that's 1946 pounds, not today. So you can treble that at least, and probably more.
I think you're underestimating it.
Yes, I know I am. And we also sent about £120 million worth of raw materials, foodstuffs, machinery and industrial plant, medical supplies, etc. Now, all of that stuff did not go to the soldiers in the British garrisons in the Far East. Like, imagine had Malaya, for example, had 1,000 tanks rather than no tanks whatsoever. The Japanese would have got nowhere.
Indeed, the Japanese conquered Singapore on bicycles. Yeah,
but they also had 2 regiments of tanks, and there were no British tanks in Malaya. There were eventually 1 squadron of British light tanks with nothing more than heavy machine guns in Singapore, but they only arrived like 2 weeks before the surrender. But imagine had 1,000 British tanks been sent to Malaya. Japanese wouldn't have got anywhere, let alone like nearly 8,000 aircraft. Imagine 2,000 modern Hurricane fighters in Singapore. Japanese would have had a very hard battle there. But none of this stuff was sent to them because Winston Churchill decided to send it to the communists in Russia. It's inconceivable to me, as a British nationalist, that you would do that.
Regarding Churchill's sort of, in terms of trying and contextualize this, for all of Churchill's purported desire to maintain the British Empire, I think Duke and I have decisively proven 60.5 billion. Again, what is that? Nearly half of the annual defense budget
Yeah.
today, so it's significant. But in terms of trying to contextualize this, I don't believe Churchill had any grand strategy regarding the British Empire, as you know, you've proven all the way back to his opposition to tariff reform in 1906.
Yes.
And if we look at his posture towards Germany and his posture towards Russia, indeed, the fact that Russia was acknowledged throughout the 19th century as the main opponent to the British Empire, I really do believe that Churchill was only capable of thinking in one mode, which was continental security, whatever that meant, even if that meant the ascent of the Soviet Union in the East and the American Empire in the West, and the detriment of the empire as a whole. I mean, this also sort of underlines the Anglo-French naval agreement of 1912. Churchill's thinking was predicated on channel security vis-a-vis the German Navy. And I don't believe he was capable of understanding the implications of maintaining the British Empire against the Italians and against the Japanese. And of course, all this did, we have the Malayan emergency in 1948. Britain relinquishes control of India in 1948 as well. 1947, sorry, thank you. And of course, what happens during the course of the war? We have Gandhi's Quit India movement. And again, the idea that Indian contribution, the contribution of the Indian Imperial Army to the British war effort, would effectively mean national sovereignty for India.
Who did he send to go and try and sort this out? The former communist Stafford Cripps, I do believe.
Yes, there was the Stafford Cripps mission. I forget. I mean, in fairness to Cripps, Cripps did become increasingly right wing after 1942. But it's something in terms of trying to underline this consistency with Churchill is that there is no partisan vision within Churchill's strategy. He is relying.
If I'd have been Churchill, I wouldn't have sent Stafford Cripps. I would have sent someone in favour of the British Empire. I just would have, you know. It's like, why send Stafford Cripps, who's, as you rightly said, a former communist, basically.
I mean, in fairness to Churchill, he was following a consistent trajectory of British policy towards India, which was increasing autonomy. So, for example, I think it was 1935, we have the Simon Report. Of course, Simon wasn't a conservative. Simon was a national liberal, which was a dwindling aspect of the coalition which had broken apart during the First World War when the liberals divided into two factions. But as a result,
am I not right, Am, that like Churchill in the 1930s got himself into a good deal of hot water, shall we say, because he tried to defend British paramountcy in India, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He was opposed, I believe, to the Simon Commission between 1935
so
and
why
1936.
send Cripps in the World War II? That doesn't make any sense to me, anyway.
But again, Duke, we're just outlining a consistent trend in Churchill, which is self-defeating. It's consistently self-defeating, no matter what the sphere is. And again, in terms of trying to understand Churchill, I will put my hands up and say, as a historian, he has a superlative way of getting concepts across in terms of immortalizing aspects in posterity. I mean, even his quote on Russia, which was, I believe, mentioned post the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland, which is, Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. All of these various aspects have a poetic quality to them, in the same way that
But that's a paraphrase of Palmerston, I do believe, over the Holstein.
Yes, and
Yeah.
actually, I think the Palmerston quote over Schleswig-Holstein was uh, only 3 men um, have the solution to the
Yeah.
Schleswig-Holstein
One
question.
of one of
One of
them
them
is
is
me,
mad.
and I've forgotten.
One of them is dead, and one of them is me, and I've forgotten.
Palmerston was a pretty cool guy, and was actually pro-British, surprisingly enough, even though he was a liberal. But yeah, Churchill was, like, to me, uh, enigma is not the right word. I think, as you said quite early
Oh
in the
no, this is
stream.
Churchill's statement towards Russia. And what I find remarkable about it is that, again, in terms of trying to give Churchill credit, Churchill understood Stalin in a way so many other politicians did not. I think he understood Stalin as representing a return to Russian imperial power, which was something that was lost on many commentators from the left to the right, indeed international commentators. But regarding Churchill in particular, there's one quote which I believe is very self-descriptive, which is that success requires moving from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. That is Churchill's career. That is not, it may sound like a wonderful witticism, but that is effectively Churchill's career. It is charismatic failure, consistent charismatic failure from
Totally, yeah, totally. I can't disagree with you, mate. I haven't. I started off, as I said to you before we went live, as a older teenager, like 18, 19. I thought Winston Churchill was this great hero. The more I have read about him, and his actions, the more he has become to me the single most important man in the destruction of the British Empire.
And what I find most remarkable and most infuriating is that permitted opposition to Churchill is based on the fact that he was an imperialist.
Which he really wasn't.
But I just find it utterly remarkable. That is a consistent thing you hear among leftists, historians, leftists in general.
Yeah, they
That,
all try and say he's a racist, blah, blah, blah.
but they look at his home. They look at his Home Office record. They look at his opposition to women's suffrage in the 1910s, etc.
Which was the one of the few base things he did. But yeah,
They look at the Cat and Mouse Act and little things like that. But they never comment on the fact that Churchill's biggest disaster was his, again, most purported and cherished wish, which was the maintenance of British imperial power. And I find that all the more remarkable.
Destroyed. Yeah, he utterly destroyed it. Can you excuse me, AM, for like 15 seconds? Because I'll let my dog back into the room. He needs to go to the loo. And I will be back in a sec. And then I would like to talk, if you don't mind, about Arctic convoys to Russia from
Absolutely.
Britain.
Thank you. I'll just deal with this comment. Churchill never understood Britain was powerful in Europe because it had a massive empire. I mean, absolutely. I mean, regarding World War I in particular, the empire was the consideration. The British Army was not a consideration really at all. In fact, the British Expeditionary Force was not considered a factor in terms of the military situation within Europe. But of course, Britain's global power was its greatest strength. And I think even if Churchill did understand this superficially, he never acted on it. And indeed, you can say the most consistent vein in a self-serving British foreign policy would have meant the maintenance of the British Empire. And of course, he always prioritized, you can say, home defense, whatever that meant, over the British Empire, even if effect meant the suicide to the British Empire. Are you back, Iron Duke?
I am. Thank you. Sorry, I have a little cross-check Russell dog who's a rescue dog. And when I got him, he was 8 and he's now 15. And I'm kind of his servant in many respects, but dogs are quite clever. So
no, I have a wonderful little cocker spaniel as well. So
cool,
I appreciate dog lovers.
Yeah, dogs are good. And you can't really be English and British without being a dog lover, in my opinion. But yeah.
You'll get no disagreement from me.
But yeah, I don't understand Winston Churchill's actions. If you look when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, in 1941, there were many defects in the so-called Singapore Fortress. Almost all of those are traceable back to Winston Churchill when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer.
In fairness to Churchill, he did do one good thing when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, albeit he didn't pursue it through his career, and he did it begrudgingly, which was putting Britain on the gold standard.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with that at all. But like,
But
He
again,
was-
to undermine that point immediately in terms of Churchill not understanding that, there was this wonderful quote where Churchill was given the office of Chancellor of the Exchequer, surprisingly, by Stanley Baldwin after having defected from the Conservative Party and over the issue of tariff reform, as you mentioned. And when he basically said to Stanley Baldwin in 1924 that I don't believe I'm qualified for that position, even though he said he'd be delighted to accept it, Stanley Baldwin replied to him saying, "Don't worry, old boy, someone will give you the figures."
which I'm sure is always true of people in that kind of position. I don't know. I mean, unless you're looking at someone like Rishi Sunak today, who is an Indian banker, I don't think you will find anyone, except possibly one or two Labour prime ministers, who are more anti-British, in effect, rather than what they claimed, than Winston Churchill.
Well, regarding this, it's quite significant, really, because Churchill appears at the Yalta Conference, which, divvying up Germany and the post-war settlement, which also, again, in terms of, because of the vagaries regarding Britain's commitment to Polish independence, in the legal sense of it, Britain did achieve Polish independence, albeit at the behest of the Red Army. And in theory, again, they were able to achieve Poland receiving some compensation for the loss of territories in the east, but in reality, all that meant was pushing the Soviet Empire westwards. So,
Yes.
on a superficial level, the British achieved their ostensible war aim, but only to the advantage of a foreign power, which was the Soviet Union, which is all the more remarkable. And in terms of bringing Labour back into this, of course, Clement Attlee had served as a Lord Privy Seal, the effective Prime Minister during the war years. And in the general election of 1945, Winston Churchill, of course, lost because he had essentially destroyed the Conservative Party to bring about the wartime coalition with him at its head. And the remarkable thing is that Churchill, had he been the leader of the Labour Party, would have probably won that election. But of course he didn't. He led a divided, weak and rudderless Conservative Party because Churchill was an appalling leader of the Conservative Party.
Look, he, in my opinion, I don't know if you agree with this, like, in my opinion, in World War II, Winston Churchill led a Labour Party in charge of Britain far more than he led a Conservative Party.
Well, I mean, look at the Beveridge Report. So, for example,
Yeah.
I mean, Churchill was responsible for bringing in many aspects of the welfare state that Labour would simply go further with. So, and this, of course, is attributed, I mean, even like school reform, 1943, 1944, the war on want, all of these aspects were started under the wartime coalition and then expanded by Labour. So you can say, at least on the domestic sphere, Winston Churchill simply created the conditions for Clement Attlee to annihilate the Conservative Party in 1945.
And also in World War II, the Army Education Corps, which was enormously expanded in World War II, and the Royal Navy and the RAF had their own equivalents, was full of socialists and communists. Which is one reason why the soldiers fighting overseas in 1945 voted against Churchill. Because they were told to by these people.
But it's all the more remarkable, though, you emphasizing that point, that even had Churchill wanted to maintain the empire, he had no effective control of personnel. He had no one to delegate to oversee his vision. And so in the end, he was left with people who were hostile to said vision.
100%. 100%.
Just
I don't think he did have a vision, to be honest.
and I hostile to the broad vision. And of course, when you're looking at competent, people who are able to utilize rhetoric as effectively as Winston Churchill, what you really need in that situation is a brain. You need someone to delegate all the actual sort of logistical, political, and sort of strategic responsibility to. And Churchill didn't have a brain. I think remarkably, Churchill believed his brain was Anthony Eden. And as you emphasize, that was utterly self-defeating as well.
Yes, absolutely. Anthony Eden was the guy who made Mussolini and Italy anti-British, which they weren't before Anthony Eden. Why did Britain care who ran Ethiopia? Did it make any difference to Britain?
But it's more than that. It's not just what did the Ethiopian War represent. It's in the same way that Japan left the League of Nations and invaded Manchuria. Why did they feel so emboldened to defy the League of Nations, having been indispensable to its formation and the maintenance of security in the East, and indeed ultimately taking over the German Empire in the Pacific and in China? It was over the issue of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
The idea that the British were allowed to maintain India, they were allowed to maintain their empire, while the Japanese were stymied in their attempt to create their own land empire in China. And again, there was all reference back to the British Empire. When looking at Manchu Kuo from 1932 onwards, the association was always the British and Australia. We are creating our own Australia, in the same sense that when Mussolini took over Abyssinia, he was simply arguing that the British already had a vast empire in Africa, as did the French. And even the Belgians, lest we forget, had a significant empire in
100% I am. Look, there was no reason for Britain to oppose Japan forming an empire in China. I mean, there wasn't really.
Well, so long as the Japanese maintained the international settlements in Hong Kong.
Yes, yeah. So long as they allowed Hong Kong to be British and various other places to belong to various other European countries, which, the Japanese had no original intention of attacking, why not? Who cares?
Indeed, better, because the Japanese would then be responsible for the security of British colonies.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, in World War I, as I said on the stream I did with the chap last week, Japanese warships escorted Anzacs from Australia and New Zealand to the Middle East. They also hunted the German East Asia squadron that the British eventually killed in the Falkland Islands, but only after Winston Churchill had made sure they won a victory against the British at Coronel, because Winston Churchill was a bloody idiot. But yeah, every single naval disaster that the Royal Navy had between 1914 and 1945, I guarantee that 95% of them you can trace back to Winston Churchill, going right up to Prince of Wales and Repulse, for example.
In terms of just summarizing my point POV from the diplomatic history before you go into the Allied bombing campaigns and the Arctic convoys, I just want to summarize my point, which is, of course, in the election, not only did Churchill essentially give way to Labour and the welfare state and the formation of the NHS and the creation of the quote-unquote post-war consensus, but from a foreign policy point of view, Churchill had even lost that control, which was now delegated to Ernst Bevin, among others, because Clement Attlee had a rather laissez-faire attitude toward foreign policy, and not a hostile but ambivalent posture towards the maintenance of the British Empire, which explains why, again, Mountbatten was sent to India in 1946 to accelerate the withdrawal of Britain from India. And just in terms of emphasizing where Churchill fits into this and the legacy of the Anglo-Soviet alliance, of course, Churchill had appraised Stalin correctly, but his ultimate his ultimate legacy, re Stalin, was in facilitating Soviet control over Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and indeed ultimately East Germany, albeit Stalin's posture towards Germany is more complicated than that. How this ends effectively is when Stalin is invited to America as leader of the opposition by Truman to make a speech. And in that speech, he talks about the Iron Curtain, which has now descended across Europe. Now, in terms of trying to understand the implications of the Iron Curtain speech, it's not as straightforward as it may seem. It does not herald the beginning of the Cold War. And in fact, I really only see an intensification from 1946 up until 1948 in the Berlin blockade crisis. But looking at 1946, Churchill had no direct control over UK foreign policy. And indeed, all I see Churchill as having achieved with the, by the way, he even got the geography wrong. The Iron Curtain did not fall between Stettin and Trieste, as is often sort of overlooked in the Iron Curtain speech. Instead, it fell roughly from Lubeck and ultimately would go bypassing Yugoslavia through Austria, which would later become independent in, when was it, 1955, having been occupied, through Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. But what the significance of the Iron Curtain speech is not for British policy at all, but for American policy. Indeed, there's this myth going around the Iron Curtain speech, which says that Truman and the American State Department had no idea that Churchill was going to deliver this speech. What was essentially a private function at the behest of the US president.
Nonsense. That
was nonsense.
Exactly
the US State Department knew exactly what he was going to say. And moreover than that, what it essentially does is it gives someone with the international gravitas, especially in America, Churchill, even though Churchill is now out of power, it essentially appears to be that Churchill, as an independent speaker, someone who isn't even working within the American political system, is calling on the Americans to harden their stance against the Soviet Union, thus beginning the Cold War.
As if Churchill didn't constantly call on the Americans for everything, but yeah.
So the remarkable thing is here that Churchill is almost explicitly acting as an agent of US foreign policy and what it will become in 1946, 1948. In terms of the significance to Churchill per se, I think, again, it's just adding to this poetic sort of device for posterity, the idea that everyone remembers the Iron Curtain. Indeed, it is essentially the de facto description for the divide between East and West during the process of the Cold War, which is solidified even more when we have the erection of the Berlin Wall, I believe it was in 1961. So again, it's a literary device for posterity, but in terms of the actual impact on British foreign policy, it's negligible. It was simply a voice to try and give legitimacy.
It was nothing. Britain was so reduced by that stage that it made no difference whatsoever. I mean, okay, Britain had, I'm not sure, in that stage it was 4 to 6 armoured divisions in Europe, which obviously these days would be enormous, but like then was not so much. But I don't think it had any effect on British foreign policy whatsoever, which was firmly run by the socialists.
But what does it do? It has an effect on Soviet foreign policy and American foreign policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does. 100%.
And again, this is the sort of remarkable thing in emphasizing that Churchill almost cannot be seen as in any way representing British self-interest at all, because in the
he had an American mother, as you pointed out yourself, fairly early on in the stream, and I think that's quite important.
Because by 1946, it's important to emphasize that the Iron Curtain really did not exist in the way that we would understand it from 1948, 1949 onwards. Despite the fact the Soviets had occupied Eastern Europe, with the exception of Poland, whose resistance and government in exile was basically impotent and under essentially the control of Rokossovsky and the Red Army, Bulgaria had switched sides and had a czar. Romania had switched sides and had a king. Hungary had fought to the finish because the Germans had invaded Hungary in 1944, deposed Horthy and put in a pro-Nazi party there, which meant Hungary was essentially forced to fight the war until the finish. However, in Czechoslovakia, the pre-war Edvard Beneš government, who was the disciple of Thomas Masaryk, the founder of Czechoslovakia, was brought in, however, in concert with a communist coalition, effectively. So Stalin, from 1945 until 1948, was paying lip service to the idea of a restoration of the pre-war status quo in some form. But as the American position in Germany hardens towards the creation of a West German state out of the French, British, and American zones of occupation, Stalin retaliates by consolidating the Soviet Empire's control over Eastern Europe and indeed creating East Germany. So you can say again, Churchill's ultimate legacy in all of this consistently is the dissolution of the British Empire to the consolidation of American and Soviet control in Europe.
100%. I can't disagree with anything you say there, mate, to be honest.
So really, that's in terms of diplomatic and political history. I think for me, that's it. But I would love to be able to hear and comment on your views regarding, again, the convoy situation and indeed Allied bombing and what effect that had in aiding or abetting Stalin.
Well, look, this is really just to pay tribute to a lot of very brave British men. To be honest, it's not going to change anything in the overall political, diplomatic sphere of anything. But I would like to pay a bit of a tribute to the many brave British men who died on Arctic convoys for Winston Churchill and Stalin. So, yeah, all right, let's do this. Hang on, I've got to find my link. I think it's this one. I beg your pardon. Forgive me, guys. I'm looking up on some stuff that I like picked up earlier. And it's a lot of stuff because there were many Arctic convoys. Okay, in total, 104 Allied merchant ships were sunk on our Arctic convoys. The vast majority of those were British merchant ships, by the way, along with 18 warships. Again, the vast majority of those were British warships. That was 829 merchant mariners who died, and 1,944 are mostly Royal Naval personnel who died. That's a lot, all right? That's a lot of ships. It's a lot of blokes, good blokes. And if you were sunk in the Arctic Ocean, you didn't have 5 minutes in the sea before you would die of hypothermia. So, like, it wasn't the case you were sunk and you might get, like, you'd sit there in your life belt. Yeah, nah, wasn't going to happen. You're going to die. And the British convoys that were going past these dudes, they were fighting against not only the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and obviously the German U-boats, the submarines. They were also fighting against the relatively few surviving large German merchant ships. Large German warships. So there were quite a few quite big battles. The most infamous one was PQ-17, which was apparently going to be intercepted by some German, by a German battleship, because there was only one by them. And it was told to scatter, and huge numbers of them were gunned down by the Air Force and the U-boats and the German destroyers, etc. Generally speaking, they did get them through, but they were carrying huge numbers of modern British tanks, modern British aircraft to Stalin's Russia, none of which were sent to the British Far East garrisons in Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. And that was an absolute choice by Churchill and his government.
And this is the counterpart, really, to the Iran situation. Of course, Iran in the Middle East and the Arctic situation in the north. And it just demonstrates the desperation and the level, the lengths which Churchill was prepared to go to provide a lifeline for the continuation of the Bolshevik government, which is all remarkable. In the north, literally transporting tanks across the Arctic, and in the south, invading a neutral country, again, in contravention of everything, to keep the Bolshevik government, which again had invaded other countries, alive. So just to emphasize and underline everything that we've been saying this stream. But you did mention before we came on about the implication of bombing and whether it was conducive to Stalin or represented a genuine attempt, victory through air power, for the Allies either to win the war on their terms or to aid and abet Soviet power.
Look, my firm conviction is that the effort spent by Bomber Command in World War II, although I am absolutely in awe of the bravery of the aircrew of Bomber Command in World War II, like they lost 58,000 dead. It was the most dangerous thing you could do as a British Commonwealth fighting man in World War II. Like your chances of surviving a 30 operation tour were very slim. Those men were very, very brave. And really you have to understand that before you can talk about what they did. On the other hand, the usefulness to it of the war effort, I think, was quite limited. And all the post-World War II bombing surveys showed that it didn't make that much difference to the end of the war.
Well, I mean, the Germans were committed to fighting until the occupation of virtually the entire country. And more than that, I think it steeled their resolve to fight on. I mean, Goebbels, say, for example, was relishing in it. But more than that, I mean, the ultimate result of it, from my point of view, which is actually something that I plan on streaming about in the future, was the cultural scouring of Germany. It has left a legacy of devastation in Germany, which Germany has never recovered from. I mean, even
Germany is not that bad a country. It's ridiculous for anyone to say it is.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Germany is not that bad a country, and it is ridiculous for anyone to say that it is.
But again, this just underlines the commitment of the Allies to fight Germany at all costs, seemingly again beyond all sort of reason and all the implications that would have for self-preservation, especially in the case of the British Empire. I mean, the Soviets and the Americans had a rationale for doing what they did, whereas the British seemingly had no rationale at all, which I always find all the more remarkable when trying to explain this. And it's something which I myself don't really have another satisfactory answer to, other than trying to, because again, it's not just Churchill. We have to look at this as a approach of the cabinet, the entire British diplomatic and military staff as well.
Most of Churchill's cabinet were Labour, of course, as you've already pointed out, AM. But yeah, look, Bolero in the chat, who I have seen many times, the horrific crimes of the Soviets coming into Germany kept the Germans fighting to the bitter end. I do agree with that, but I don't also think that the Germans didn't do their own degree of horrific crimes when they were going to the Soviet Union. Like, humans are humans, and a lot of us are not very good. But yeah, absolutely. Like in 1944-45, the Soviets were not good guys going into Germany at all. Although I've also seen people try and say the Brits and the Americans were the same, and I think that's somewhat exaggerated.
But compared to the Soviets, there's no comparison. But it's not just what the Soviets did to the Germans. I mean, in terms of civilian casualties. I mean, civilian casualties in Germany were not the equivalent of civilian casualties in the Soviet Union, but the levels of rape we're talking about are on
Yeah,
untold scale. And not just that, but ultimately ethnic cleansing. From 1944 up until 1948, 10 million, if not more, ethnic Germans removed the Ostdeutsche, removed from the east and settled mainly in what is now Western Germany, what was then would become
100%. Yeah, no,
the Federal
you're
Republic of
totally
Germany.
right. You're totally right.
So it is significant, but even within the Soviet Union, we're talking about mass population transfers of Russia's own German population in the Volga, its own Cossack population in the Crimea. Indeed, any population that was even perceived to be in any way sympathetic to the Germans was forcefully relocated into Central Asia. Often
I think Stalin was evil, by the way. Let me make that clear. I absolutely think Stalin was an evil man, and until 1942, he made Hitler look like a mere amateur in mass murder.
Well, in terms of overall, I mean, I need to put this out there as a historian and say that you should always be skeptical about absolute numbers in terms of casualties. There's always revisionism going on. There's always sort of compilation of this. Some are more accurate than others. But in terms of going off very broad numbers, Hitler killed roughly. I mean, Hitler killed even in terms of the Jewish population. Hitler killed very few of his own population other than as a result of the war, whereas
Yes.
Stalin killed roughly 20 million of his own people.
Yeah, I'm 100%. I totally agree with that. Like I said, until probably 1942, Hitler was a mere amateur at mass murder compared to Stalin.
I love it. Someone in the chat is saying the situation of rape in Germany was so bad that even his left-wing college history classes had an assignment on it. Is the one thing that is sort of begrudgingly acknowledged German war crimes. But there is, before we go, Andrew, there is one thing which I need to bring up, which is the culmination of the Eastern Front. Because we talked about the Western Front, which of course was advantageous to the Americans and Stalin. British policy from 1942 onwards, having lost Singapore, Burma, it should be noted, as well, and having
which
the Japanese,
we then did take back, to be fair,
in 1944,
yeah,
and 1945.
under the brilliant General Bill Slim.
But what British policy essentially was rescuing all of the British Empire in the East, which the Japanese had taken, and not rescuing it from the Japanese, but rescuing it from the Americans.
Yes.
In 1943, the Allies had declared that all the international settlements in China would cease. The implication, therefore, was that the French concession and indeed Hong Kong would also be ceded to China. So there was a mad rush by the Allies, by Britain in particular, to regain Hong Kong, to prevent the Americans handing Hong Kong over to the Chinese.
Which they did.
And by the Americans, by the same token, did the same. Rather than directly focusing on Okinawa and Japan, the invasion of Japan, the Americans instead reconquered the Philippines to avoid the Philippines becoming independent after the war. The main power that didn't achieve this, which is the reconstitution of the empires as they existed before the war, were of course the Dutch. And the only reason for that is because the Dutch had no power to do so. And when they did do so after the war, the Americans, the Soviets, and the British stopped them from doing so.
Well, I wouldn't say the British, but they had limited powers.
Limited influence. I mean, we're talking the British almost as an extension of the Americans at this point.
Under Attlee, absolutely, fair enough.
So this is sort of quite remarkable in terms of outlining the fatalistic nature of Churchill's policy towards the East. And of course, regarding the empowerment of the Americans on the one hand, of course, the Americans go on, they occupy Japan. Japan will then become forcefully integrated into NATO, as ultimately will South Korea, when Stalin gives the go-ahead for Kim Il-sung to invade from the north, and thus precipitate the Korean War, if I remember, in 1950. And of course, this is overlooking Stalin's greatest achievement, which I would say is less Stalin's and very much due to Mao, because Stalin hadn't actually predicted this himself, which is switching China from pro-America to pro-communist. Indeed, the Americans themselves were roughly ambivalent towards Chiang Kai-shek, and the ambassador, if I believe, to China, I forget his name, was basically pro-Mao during this situation.
Well, I mean, if you look at like American policy today on Taiwan, it's still pretty ambivalent, isn't it?
I would say less so. I would say
Yeah,
that was,
less so, because the Americans these days want a war against China. I'm not sure it's a good idea, but they want one.
I think in terms of the situation, what essentially is the worst outcome for Britain in China? Not only the loss of the international settlements, but flipping China communist. And flipping China communist in a way that is aggressively hostile to the West, as we see with the Korean War, and as later we will see by the extreme isolationism and anti-Westernism, which really persists in China throughout the 1950s. And indeed, that strain is even directed back against the Soviets after the death of Stalin and the Sino-Soviet split in the early 1960s, which is...
You can also look at stuff like the Yangtze incident, where HMS Amethyst was trapped up a Chinese river by the Chinese communists. There's a pretty good film about it, actually, which is fairly accurate, where the British warship, a small warship, by the way, eventually manages to fight our way out of it. And the British, rightly, in 48, 49, said, yeah, great, this is the Royal Navy doing their stuff again. But it was certainly not something that the Americans supported.
So I think that's really the end of the sordid tale of the Anglo-Soviet alliance during the course of the Second World War. Again, I'm just constantly... I'll put my hands up and say that I do not understand British foreign policy from 1914, because British foreign policy from 1914 to this day is completely self-defeating. Consistently
100% agree. 100% agree with you.
In fact, I would actually say that one of the few inspired foreign policy choices in the last 100 years was Harold Wilson keeping us out of the Vietnam War. One of the very few.
Maybe. I do also like Margaret Thatcher taking back the Falkland Islands. I thought that was
but Margaret Thatcher also surrendered Hong Kong, lest we forget.
Yeah, I know she did, and I don't forgive her for that. Which she didn't need to do. She could have reinforced the place and said, "Fuck you."
Well, not just that. Legalistically, the Chinese only had a claim on the new territories and not on Hong Kong.
Yeah, 100%. The 99-year lease was on the new territories. Actual Hong Kong itself, the peninsula and the main island, were absolutely British forever. And I totally agree. And I don't forgive her for that.
And to be honest, I mean, in my cynical view, I simply believe that the British thought that handing over Hong Kong would be an entree to improved trading relations with Deng Xiaoping and his successors. That's all I believe it was, effectively surrendering Hong Kong for a promise which was ultimately sort of only to the benefit of China in the long term, which was...
I don't agree with that, but only because had I been the British Prime Minister, I would have reinforced the place. I would have had a British division there with an armoured brigade and said, well, sorry guys, we're not going to do this.
But again, who would have been the one to veto that? It wouldn't have been the British government, it would have been the Americans.
But the Americans didn't have the power to veto that in the 1980s. They probably could today under Rishi Sunak, but back then, no, I don't think they could at all. I mean, the Americans wanted to veto the Falklands War, but Maggie said, nah, went on to do that.
Yes, but there's a difference between pissing off the Argentinians and pissing off the Chinese, especially as post 1972, the Americans had under Kissinger leveraged the support of China as a means of counteracting Soviet influence. And even when we talk about 1986, which I believe is the year in which the agreement was made by Thatcher to hand over
Yep,
Hong Kong,
yep.
this was even really before Perestroika and Glasnost was taking effect in the
Oh yeah, it
in the
was
Soviet Union.
long before. It was three years before at least.
So before the economic considerations, I mean, Gorbachev, when did he get into power? 1985. So just
Yeah.
1 year, Gorbachev. So even before we talk about the economic considerations, which is still pertinent to today, the strategic considerations for the United States were insurmountable to the point that I believe wholeheartedly, had Thatcher wanted to make a stand on Hong Kong, the Americans would have stabbed us in the back, as they constantly do.
Oh,
because
I'm sure they would have stabbed
because
us in
the
back.
special relationship
Yeah,
has always been a
yeah.
myth. The special
Yeah,
relationship.
the special relationship is a total myth, only believed by moronic British people. But yeah, I do believe they would have stabbed us in the back. But I also think in 1986, Britain was just about powerful enough that we could have said, "Well, get fuck them." As I think we absolutely were in 1956, for example, over Suez.
In terms of what I really have to say, I mean, that's where I would conclude my remarks. So, is there anything you sort of want to go over before we
Yeah,
end?
like I said, in 1956, the Americans put a certain amount of pressure on the pound. But I do believe if Anthony Eden had been less of a cuck, he could have turned around and said, "Well, okay, do that. If you want to destroy your biggest ally in Europe, go ahead." And I don't think the Americans would have done so in the end, because I don't think they could have done so. And I think the same thing pretty much applies to Margaret Thatcher over Hong Kong.
I think
Had
our
she,
position. I think our position in Suez was even stronger because, lest we forget, Suez was a joint venture
yes,
between the French, because the French, of course, also had a significant stake in Suez,
100%.
and also it was also supported by Israel. Lest we also forget.
Yes, 100%. I totally agree with all those things.
So on every,
I was taking it for read that everyone knew that stuff. But yeah,
it's important to sort of underline, especially the Israeli connection and the idea of the anti-pan-Arabism, which was, I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, seeing the ambivalence of Eisenhower towards wanting to cozy up to Nasser and a potential sort of a grand Arab alliance, which will form, again, a consistent trend in American foreign policy to aid and abet in the allies against the British Empire consistently, even if that meant weakening the two greatest bulwarks in Europe against the Soviet Union.
Yeah. And like I said, same thing. Go to 1986. And if Thatcher had done as she did in 1982 and said to the Americans, "Look, guys, you have to make a choice here. Do you like your South American ally or your most important ally in the whole world," which then was Britain? Had she done the same thing in 86, and she wasn't brave enough to do it, but she also had more people attacking her in the Conservative Party at that stage, I don't think the Americans would have said, "Nah, we're going to cast over the Brits." But that's the only way the Brits ever get anything out of this so-called special relationship. You have to really push the Americans to the nth degree. And these days, you can't even do that because the British Armed Forces are so weak. The Americans laugh at them, the Russians laugh at them, the Chinese laugh at them, everyone laughs at them. I do say that if a British carrier group ever ends up in the South China Sea, the Chinese will laugh on the other side of their face, but that's merely because I have a son in the Royal Navy.
Well, I think that's a rather depressing note in which to leave the stream.
I don't know, man. Like, I want my son to leave the Royal Navy, but because we're not fighting for anything that is British anymore. Do I support China taking over Taiwan? No, I don't. But that's largely based on the fact that the Japanese have said many times they'll fight to defend Taiwan. And if I was Japanese, I would too, because if they take Taiwan, their next target is going to be Japan.
Well, not
Because
just that, of course, because in that brief period, you know, between 1945 and 1948, where the mainland and Taiwan was still, you know, ruled over by the same government. Before then, the Japanese had ruled it between
Yeah.
1895 and 1945. So Taiwan has been a pivotal factor in Japanese strategic policy making since before the first Sino-Japanese War in the end of the 19th century. You know,
100%.
the geopolitical realities haven't changed since then, especially as the Chinese and the Japanese have remained consistently hostile throughout that entire time, World War II or no.
100% I am. If only Britain could be so consistent. Like Britain does. Does it make any difference to Britain who runs Ukraine? No, it doesn't. It's entirely peripheral.
But there is a consistency there isn't there? That Japan is allowed an independent foreign policy insofar as it's anti-Chinese. Britain is allowed a foreign policy insofar as it's anti-Russian.
Yeah, or pro-American. There's another way to put it, I guess. I'm not desperately pro-American. I am friends with many very good Americans, but they ain't part of the American government, which has been anti-British ever since it was created, I would dare to say. Like, the American government has been anti-British since it was created as a rebellion against the British government. So I don't have any friends in that regard. Could I suggest to you, I have two other subjects I'd love to do a stream with you on. One is the Anglo-Japanese naval treaty, which I think was extremely interesting. It was the first treaty the British did in the 19th century. And it was the only one the Conservatives did. And I also think it was the only good one that Britain did in the early 20th century. And the other one would be what happened in the in the Falklands War in 1982. I think that would be a quite interesting stream to do historically.
I think regarding the Falklands, I'm really not sort of qualified to speak about that. But regarding 1902, I am very interested in the period following the Second Boer War up until Britain's declaration of war with Germany in 1914, regarding trying to appraise what British foreign policy was ultimately about, because everyone actually seems to forget that it wasn't Grey who was responsible for the Entente Cordiale. It was actually his predecessor, Lord Lansdowne, who was a conservative in 1905. And I do believe that the Japanese...
he started it, but Grey engraved it in Britain.
Grey intensified it with the 1912 naval agreement, and of course corroborated it with the 1907 understanding over Iran, which was later wrongly construed as a military alliance, but there you are. But it'll be interesting to consider what British foreign policy actually was meant to be, as opposed to what it was recontrived to be on the eve of World War One, because I do believe there is a complete schizophrenic about turn in terms of British foreign policy up until that point, where, I mean, just to summarize, where Britain had been increasingly looking at limiting its colonial expenditure and possible points of stress on the empire, like Japan in the east, like Russia and Iran, like France and Africa, and in World War One, they threw all of that out the window and went full on destruction of the British Empire.
Yeah, I'd raised a mass land army against all British military historical experience, with
And
the results you would expect.
And of course, there would be an opportunity, I think, to discuss the tariff situation as well.
Yeah, if you're interested in that, I would love to do a stream with you on that. It's one of the things I've been interested in for probably 20 years now. But yeah, love to. Did you have anything you would like to plug, like your channel or upcoming streams? And I know you've got a couple coming up on stuff related to this subject.
Thank you, Iron Duke, for having me on this stream. It's been great fun, and I'm fortunate in a way because my voice didn't give out at all. I think so long as I have a couple of breaks and I'm allowed to sort of drink sort of efficacious tea, then I can survive. But unfortunately, I can't really survive on my own. So thank you for doing this. I hope to be doing my own sort of more concise version of my thoughts in a sort of lecture format next week, and that would be following on from a roundtable discussion on the nature of Stalin's grand strategy, which obviously this stream has been more Churchill centric. So and again, I do want to emphasize that I admire Stalin on a strategic level, but it's not supposed to in any way condone his behavior as anything other than evil. So just
No,
to
no one thinks you believe in the Holodomor, for example.
yes, in reality, I'm actually a closeted Bolshevik and have been this entire time. I just put on reactionary acts.
No, you're a czarist. Everyone knows this.
Well, thank you very much, Iron Duke.
Your channel and anything else you wanted to plug?
That's it. Just the two streams, which are coming next week. So
okay, you will find AM's channel in the description to this stream. So check him out. Yeah, look, AM is absolutely one of the best historical channels on YouTube. I don't always agree with it. AM is a bit too pro-French and pro-Catholic for me, but I can still admire him as a historian who keeps a reasonably he keeps his view reasonably free of that stuff.
well, I do have to admit, Iron Duke, that I'm in this bizarre situation of condemning British foreign policy whilst also appearing pro-French. So I think that's the most egregious position for a Brit to ever take. So I do emphasize the hostility which you may have for that position. I can
listen.
appreciate it.
I'm a typical Englishman. I'm very anti-French, and I'm not particularly Catholic. Although my mother was Catholic, my dad was Church of England, my mother was Roman Catholic. So I can kind of get that. But if you watch AM streams and you just allow for that little bit of bias, and it isn't huge, they're still great. And AM has one of the best historical channels on YouTube. He just does. I'm sorry, he does. All right. Let me check something. I suppose I should go and check this. We do have a few super chats. I'm sorry, I've just noticed you said your throat wasn't very good, but we do have a few. So, I don't think it's many; it's only a couple. The first one is from. How do I? Josephina Herringway for USD $25. Thank you for an interesting stream. Well, I guess that doesn't take much. reply it, to be honest. That may be our only super chat. So there you go. Thank you, Josephina. Joseph, I think, is what he prefers to be called. AM, any final thoughts?
No, just again, thank you so much for having me on. It's been great to discuss this topic.
Mate, you are welcome on my stream anytime whatsoever. And it's been a great honor to have you on my stream. Thank you. Go on. Next stream I'm going to be doing is, let me think, Splendid Isolation on Saturday, UK time. Go and check us out there. Please do subscribe, gents. That would be good. And like the stream if you liked it. If you didn't, then you don't know much about history, so we'll see. Go on, guys. Before I leave, I'm going to play us out with a song. And the reason I'm going to play us out with this song is in contrast to the Soviet song I played at the beginning. You're kidding me.
We're the D-Day Dodgers out in Italy, always on the vino, always on the spree. 8th Army Skivers and the Yanks, we live in Rome and stuff the twanks. For we're the D-Day Dodgers out in Italy. We landed at Salerno, a holiday with pay. Jerry brought a band out to cheer us on our way. Showed us the sights and gave us tea. We all sang songs, the beer was free. For we're the D-Day Dodgers out in Italy. Naples and Casino were taken in our stride. We didn't get to fight there, we just went for the ride. Anzio and Sangro were a farce. We did fuck all, sat on our arse. For we're the D-Day Dodgers out in Italy. On the way to Florence, we had a lovely time. We ran a bus to Rimini, right through the Gothic vine. Soon to Bologna we will go, when Jerry's fucked off beyond the Po. For we're the D-Day Dodgers out in Italy. Once we had a bright light that we were going home, back to dear old Blighty, never more to roam. Then someone whispered, in France you'll fight. We said, fuck that, we'll just sit tight. For we're the D-Day Dodgers out in Italy. Lady Astor, please listen in to this. Don't stand up on the platform and talk a lot of piss. You're the nation's sweetheart, the nation's pride, but your bloody big mouth is far too wide. That's from the D-Day Dodgers out in Italy. If you look round the mountains in the mud and rain, you'll find the scattered crosses, some which bear no name. Heartbreak and toil and suffering gone, the lads beneath them slumber on. For they were the D-Day Dodgers who'll stay in Italy.
True. Where does that come from? Okay, forgive me, guys. D.A. Dodgers is a pretty well-known British song, which was the result of Lady Astor, an extremely rich half-American MP, claiming that most of the Eighth Army who were fighting in Italy were D-Day Dodgers, despite the fact they'd been fighting the Germans for about 3 years, and then she wanted them sent back to the UK to then go and land in Normandy to fight the Germans again. I don't know how many years are you supposed to fight the enemy for in World War II. Winston Churchill didn't say a word about any of those people. So, you know. But then he was, as AM decisively proved in this chat, supported mainly by the Labour Party, which I've been saying for years too. He's not a conservative. Anyone who thinks Winston Churchill was conservative is deluding themselves. Anything else to say, Anne, before we end?
No, as you can probably tell, actually, my voice is gone, I'm afraid.
Oh, man, I'm so sorry. I beg your pardon, sir. All right. Thank you so much, AM, for coming on. Love to do another stream with you. And thank you for chat for listening to us. Go well, and do please go and subscribe to Apostolic Majesty's channel. Good night.